2 million entered the ruins of Stalingrad, but almost none walked out unchanged. Welcome to In&Out Nazi Germany. You are about to enter one of the darkest, deadliest, and most mysterious chapters of human history, the Battle of Stalingrad. A city where every street, every shattered wall, every grain of snow carried the weight of life and death. It was not just a battle. It was the turning point of the Second World War, where more than 2 million men and women were swallowed by fire, hunger, and ice. Throughout this series, you'll travel through the ruins, walk with the soldiers, hear the whispers of the trapped civilians, and witness how one battle reshaped the destiny of the world. Each chapter peels back another layer of this nightmare. And the more you listen, the more you'll realize why Stalingrad is remembered as the deadliest struggle in history. If you're ready to go deeper than you've ever gone before, stay with me through this series. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1, The Prelude: Europe on the Brink of Fire. By the summer of 1942, Europe had already been at war for nearly 3 years, and the continent was scarred beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins, entire populations were displaced, and the machinery of industrial warfare had reached a scale never before imagined. Nazi Germany stood at the height of its territorial expansion. France had fallen, Poland had been crushed, the Balkans subdued, and much of Western Europe lived under occupation. To many observers at the time, the Third Reich appeared unstoppable. Yet beneath the surface of German dominance, the war had begun to change in subtle but critical ways. Resources were stretched thin, supply lines grew longer, and the confidence that once powered Germany's lightning victories was slowly eroding. Nowhere was this shift more apparent than on the vast Eastern Front, where the German invasion of the Soviet Union had transformed the conflict into a war of annihilation. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, was intended to destroy the Red Army in a matter of months, seize vital territory, and eliminate what Hitler saw as both a military and ideological enemy. Instead, it unleashed a struggle of unimaginable scale. Millions of soldiers clashed across forests, plains, and cities stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Initial German successes were staggering, with entire Soviet armies encircled and destroyed, but the Soviet Union did not collapse. It absorbed the blows, retreated deeper into its territory, and continued to fight. By the winter of 1941, the German advance stalled at the gates of Moscow, where exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and fierce Soviet resistance shattered the myth of German invincibility. When the spring thaw arrived in 1942, both sides prepared for the next phase of the war, knowing that the coming summer would be decisive. For Adolf Hitler, the answer lay in the South. He believed that Germany's future depended on oil, steel, and resources, and the vast oil fields of the Caucasus became his obsession. Capturing them, he believed, would cripple the Soviet war effort while fueling Germany's own armies. At the same time, the city of Stalingrad emerged as a symbolic and strategic target. Situated on the Volga River, Stalingrad was a major industrial hub and a critical transport artery linking northern and southern Russia. Its very name carried immense propaganda value. To Hitler, capturing the city that bore Stalin's name would deal a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet leadership. To Joseph Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. Thus, long before the first German soldier set foot in the city, Stalingrad had already become more than a point on a map. It was destined to become a symbol, a proving ground, and eventually a graveyard. As preparations intensified, the German High Command devised a new offensive plan known as Case Blue. Unlike Barbarossa, which had attempted to strike across the entire Eastern Front. This new operation focused primarily on the south. Army Group South would push eastward across the Ukrainian steppes, split into two forces, and drive simultaneously toward the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga River. On paper, the plan promised decisive results. In reality, it demanded precision, speed, and coordination that the German army was no longer guaranteed to deliver. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union braced itself. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses since 1941, but it had also learned painful lessons. Factories were relocated beyond the Urals, new divisions were raised, and commanders began adapting to German tactics. Stalin, once paralyzed by fear and distrust, now allowed his generals greater freedom to plan and respond. Yet the cost of every delay, every mistake, remained immense. Civilians continued to bear the brunt of the war, enduring bombings, hunger, and forced evacuations. As the German summer offensive began to gather momentum, trains loaded with soldiers, tanks, and artillery rolled eastward. Luftwaffe aircraft prepared to dominate the skies once more. Soldiers believed they were marching toward another victory, unaware that they were moving toward one of the greatest disasters in military history. On the opposite side, Soviet forces dug trenches, reinforced river crossings, and prepared for a battle they knew would be brutal beyond measure. The Volga River flowed steadily through Stalingrad, unaware that it would soon become a lifeline stained with blood. All the elements were now in place. The ambitions of dictators, the suffering of millions, and the momentum of a world at war converged toward a single city. The stage was set, the armies were moving, and history was about to descend upon Stalingrad with a force that would echo for generations. Chapter 1, Segment 2, Hitler's Gamble, The Road Toward Stalingrad. As the spring of 1942 turned into summer, Adolf Hitler stood at a crossroads in the war against the Soviet Union. The failure to capture Moscow the previous winter haunted the German High Command, but rather than reassess the limits of German power, Hitler doubled down on his belief that boldness alone could still secure victory. He was convinced that the Soviet Union was already on the verge of collapse, that one final, decisive blow would shatter its ability to fight. This conviction shaped every decision that followed. The Eastern Front stretched for thousands of miles, consuming men, fuel, ammunition, and equipment at an alarming rate. Germany's economy, though formidable, was beginning to feel the strain of a prolonged war on multiple fronts. Britain still resisted in the West, the Atlantic War raged at sea, and American industrial power loomed ominously after the United States entered the conflict in late 1941. Yet Hitler believed time favored Germany, provided the Red Army could be crippled in the East before Allied strength fully matured. His answer was a dramatic shift in strategy. Rather than renewing the push toward Moscow, Hitler fixated on the southern Soviet Union, where vast resources promised both immediate and long-term rewards. The oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly those around Baku, were essential to the Soviet war machine. Without them, Hitler reasoned, Soviet tanks, aircraft, and vehicles would grind to a halt. Securing this oil would also solve Germany's own chronic fuel shortages, which threatened to paralyze its mechanized forces. In Hitler's mind, the campaign was not just about territory, but about economic survival. To reach the Caucasus, however, German forces would have to advance hundreds of miles across open steppe, vulnerable to counterattacks and dependent on overstretched supply lines. This risk did little to deter Hitler. Instead, he split Army Group South into two separate formations. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus, while Army Group B would move east toward the Volga River. At the center of this eastern thrust stood Stalingrad. Strategically, the city controlled river traffic along the Volga, a vital artery for transporting oil, grain, and troops between northern and southern Russia. Disrupting this flow would deal a severe blow to Soviet logistics. Symbolically, the city's name transformed it into a prize of immense propaganda value. Capturing Stalingrad would allow Hitler to claim a personal victory over Stalin himself, reinforcing the narrative of Nazi supremacy. What began as a supporting objective soon became an obsession. Orders from Berlin increasingly emphasized the importance of taking the city, even as conditions on the ground grew more difficult. German generals, including Friedrich Paulus of the Sixth Army, expressed concern about the risks involved. They warned that splitting forces reduced flexibility and left flanks exposed, particularly to Soviet counteroffensives. Hitler dismissed these concerns, convinced that Soviet resistance was already broken. Meanwhile, the Red Army was far from defeated. Though battered and bloodied, it continued to mobilize vast reserves of manpower. Soviet commanders recognized the danger posed by the German advance toward the Volga, but they also saw opportunity. Every mile the Germans advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Fuel shortages became routine, spare parts scarce, and replacement troops increasingly inexperienced. Soviet intelligence began piecing together German intentions, identifying the southern offensive as the likely focus of the coming campaign. Stalin, deeply distrustful by nature, nonetheless grasped the stakes. He issued a stark order that would soon become infamous: not one step back. The defense of key cities and regions was to be absolute regardless of cost. Retreat without authorization was punishable by death. This directive reflected both desperation and resolve. Stalingrad, in particular, was to be held at all costs. As summer progressed, German forces surged forward. The vast open plains allowed armored units to move rapidly, encircling Soviet formations and capturing thousands of prisoners. The Luftwaffe once again dominated the skies, bombing rail lines, bridges, and troop concentrations. From a distance, it appeared that the German gamble was paying off. Reports reaching Berlin spoke of renewed success, reinforcing Hitler's confidence. Yet beneath these victories lay warning signs. Soviet resistance, though chaotic at times, grew increasingly stubborn. Units fought to the last man, refusing surrender even when surrounded. Civilians were drawn into the chaos, fleeing eastward or pressed into labor as the front approached. Entire villages vanished under bombardment. The war was no longer a clash of armies alone, but a struggle that consumed everything in its path. By late summer, the German advance began to slow as it approached the Volga. Dust, heat, and mechanical failures plagued the troops. Supplies lagged behind the pace of the advance. Still, Hitler pressed forward, issuing orders that left little room for maneuver. Stalingrad now stood directly in the path of the Sixth Army. What had begun as part of a broader strategy evolved into a single-minded fixation. The city was no longer just a strategic objective. It became a test of will between two dictators. Unknown to the soldiers marching toward it, Stalingrad would soon transform from a name on a map into the most infamous battlefield of the Second World War. Chapter 1, Segment 3. The Volga beckons. A city becomes a destiny. By late summer of 1942, the distant name of Stalingrad had ceased to be an abstract objective and instead became a looming presence over every German staff meeting, every Soviet command post, and every soldier marching eastward across the scorched plains. The Volga River, wide and slow-moving, shimmered on maps like a final boundary between ambition and catastrophe. For Adolf Hitler, reaching it meant proof that his vision of conquest was still alive. For Joseph Stalin, allowing the Germans to reach it meant humiliation, collapse, and possibly the end of the Soviet state itself. Between these two wills lay a city that few outside Russia had ever thought important before the war, yet which would soon eclipse all others in bloodshed and symbolism. Stalingrad was not merely an industrial center or a transportation hub. It was a name heavy with meaning, echoing the authority of Stalin himself. Losing it would be a propaganda disaster, while defending it could become a rallying cry for a nation fighting for survival. As German forces pushed closer, the landscape began to change. The endless steppe gave way to smoke-darkened horizons as factories, rail yards, and residential districts came into view. Luftwaffe bombers roared overhead, dropping high explosives and incendiaries that shattered neighborhoods and turned wooden houses into firestorms. Within days, much of the city lay in ruins. Streets vanished beneath rubble. Entire families were buried alive before German infantry ever set foot inside the city. Yet these ruins, intended to break Soviet resistance, would soon become a deadly advantage for the defenders. The shattered city offered endless hiding places, firing positions, and opportunities for ambush. What had once been orderly streets and factory floors became a jagged maze where tanks struggled to maneuver and long-range firepower lost much of its effectiveness. As the German Sixth Army approached the Volga's western bank, Soviet authorities faced impossible choices. Evacuation of civilians was partial and chaotic. Thousands managed to cross the river under bombardment, while many others stayed behind, either unable or unwilling to leave. Men too old or too young for the army were drafted into labor battalions, digging trenches, building barricades, and carrying ammunition. Women worked in factories until bombs destroyed the machinery around them, then joined firefighting crews or medical units. Children scavenged for food and water in streets littered with corpses. The line between civilian and soldier blurred completely. On the Soviet side, commanders understood that a conventional defense would fail. They could not match German firepower in open battle, nor could they allow the enemy to establish firm control along the Volga. Instead, they adopted a doctrine of proximity. Soviet units were ordered to fight as close to the Germans as possible, often within grenade range, denying the Luftwaffe and artillery clear targets. This brutal tactic would later be called hugging the enemy. It ensured constant, grinding combat where no position was secure and no rest possible. For German soldiers, expectations of a swift victory began to erode. The rapid advances of previous campaigns had conditioned them to believe that Soviet resistance would eventually crumble. Instead, they encountered defenders who refused to retreat, even when encircled. Snipers began to appear, invisible and patient, turning every window and pile of rubble into a potential death trap. Supply problems worsened as trucks broke down and fuel shortages became routine. Ammunition had to be rationed. Casualties mounted steadily, and replacements arriving at the front were increasingly young and poorly trained. Still, orders from above remained uncompromising. Stalingrad was to be taken, street by street if necessary. Meanwhile, across the Volga's eastern bank, Soviet reinforcements gathered under constant threat from German air attacks. Barges and small boats ferried soldiers across at night, often under fire, with many never reaching the shore. The river itself became a graveyard, choked with wreckage and bodies carried by the current. Yet the flow of men and supplies never fully stopped. Each crossing represented defiance, a refusal to surrender the city. Stalin's message was clear: Stalingrad must not fall. Political officers reinforced discipline with ruthless measures. Retreat without orders was met with execution or imprisonment. Fear became both a weapon and a motivator. At the same time, propaganda emphasized heroism, sacrifice, and the defense of the motherland. The city was portrayed not as a doomed outpost, but as a sacred ground where the fate of the war would be decided. As September approached, the German advance slowed to a crawl. What had been envisioned as a decisive strike toward the Volga now transformed into a grinding struggle for individual buildings, stairwells, and basements. Factories like the Red October, the Barricade, and the tractor factory took on mythical status, changing hands multiple times in a single day. Every gain was paid for in blood. Officers on both sides began to realize that Stalingrad was no longer just a battle. It was becoming a vortex, pulling in divisions, resources, and attention far beyond its original strategic value. Yet neither side could disengage without admitting defeat. The city had become destiny. For the soldiers trapped within its ruins, the war narrowed to the next room, the next corner, the next sunrise. The stage was set for a confrontation unlike anything the world had ever seen. A battle where victory would not be measured in miles gained, but in endurance, suffering, and the willingness to fight to the very end. Chapter 2, Segment 1, Hitler's Gamble, The Road Toward the Volga. By the beginning of 1942, the Second World War had entered a dangerous new phase. Germany's lightning victories of the early years were gone, replaced by a grinding, global conflict that tested the limits of men, machines, and ideology. Operation Barbarossa, launched with breathtaking confidence the previous summer, had failed to deliver the decisive collapse Hitler had promised. Moscow still stood. The Red Army, battered and bloodied, had not broken. Instead, it regrouped, learned, and adapted. For Adolf Hitler, this failure was not merely military, it was personal. He refused to accept that his vision of conquest could be flawed, and rather than consolidating gains or adopting a defensive posture, he chose escalation. In his mind, the war could still be won by one bold, crushing blow. That blow, he believed, would fall in the South. The new strategy for 1942 was ambitious and reckless in equal measure. Hitler ordered a massive offensive aimed at the southern Soviet Union, targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus while simultaneously striking toward the Volga River. Oil, he believed, was the key to victory. Germany's war machine depended on fuel, and seizing Soviet oil resources would not only sustain the Wehrmacht but also cripple the Red Army. This plan, known as Case Blue, split German forces into multiple directions, stretching supply lines across vast distances and leaving flanks dangerously exposed. Experienced generals raised objections, warning that dividing strength invited disaster, but Hitler overruled them all. He trusted his intuition over professional military advice, convinced that willpower alone could overcome geography, logistics, and resistance. As German armies moved eastward once again, the early stages of the campaign appeared to justify Hitler's confidence. Soviet forces retreated under pressure, cities fell, and vast territories were overrun. Yet beneath the surface, warning signs multiplied. Roads disintegrated into dust in summer and mud in rain. Vehicles broke down faster than they could be repaired. Horses died by the tens of thousands, leaving artillery stranded. Fuel shortages forced commanders to make impossible choices about which units could advance and which would be left behind. The farther the Germans moved from their railheads, the weaker their grip became. Still, momentum carried them forward. Hitler's obsession increasingly focused on Stalingrad, though its capture had not originally been the primary objective. The city's name, bearing Stalin's own, took on immense symbolic weight in Hitler's mind. Capturing it would be a psychological blow, a propaganda triumph, and proof that German arms remained unstoppable. What began as a supporting objective soon became an obsession. Orders shifted repeatedly, creating confusion at the front. Entire formations were redirected mid-campaign, wasting precious time and energy. Army Group South was split into two forces. Army Group A pushed toward the Caucasus, while Army Group B was tasked with taking Stalingrad. This division weakened both thrusts, leaving neither with sufficient strength to guarantee success. Meanwhile, Soviet leadership watched these developments closely. Stalin, who had once interfered disastrously in military planning, now showed signs of learning. He listened more carefully to his generals, allowed flexibility, and focused on preserving manpower. The Soviet Union had one advantage Germany could not match: depth. Every mile the Germans advanced lengthened their supply lines and shortened Soviet ones. Factories dismantled and moved east continued producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in staggering numbers. New divisions were raised, trained, and sent westward, often with minimal equipment but unyielding determination. The Red Army did not need to win quickly, it only needed to survive. As summer wore on, German forces approached the Volga basin. The heat was oppressive, dust clogged engines and lungs, and exhaustion spread through the ranks. Casualties mounted steadily, not only from combat but from disease, accidents, and sheer fatigue. The myth of invincibility that had once surrounded the Wehrmacht continued to erode. Soldiers began to sense that something had changed, that this campaign felt different from the swift victories of France and the Balkans. There was no decisive breakthrough, no enemy collapse. Instead, resistance stiffened with every mile. Yet retreat was unthinkable. Hitler's orders were explicit: advance no matter the cost. At headquarters, maps were marked with bold arrows and confident annotations, masking the reality unfolding on the ground. German intelligence underestimated Soviet reserves and failed to recognize the growing threat along the flanks, where poorly equipped Axis allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops, were tasked with holding vast stretches of front. These units lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, winter clothing, and logistical support. They were expected to defend against an enemy that was learning rapidly and preparing something far larger than a simple defense of a city. By late summer 1942, the German Sixth Army stood on the threshold of Stalingrad. What had begun as a strategic maneuver aimed at resources and rivers had transformed into a personal duel between two dictators, each unwilling to yield. Hitler had gambled everything on a single campaign, convinced that victory lay just ahead. He did not see the trap forming, nor did he fully grasp the scale of the forces gathering beyond the horizon. The road to Stalingrad had been paved with ambition, miscalculation, and hubris, and once crossed, there would be no easy way back. Chapter 2, Segment 2. The City of Stalin: Symbol, Obsession, and Fate. As the German advance pushed deeper into southern Russia in the summer of 1942, one city began to dominate the thoughts of both Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin alike. Stalingrad was not merely a point on a map. It was a symbol, a name heavy with ideological weight, standing on the banks of the Volga River like a challenge issued by one dictator to another. For Hitler, capturing Stalingrad promised more than tactical advantage. It was a chance to humiliate his enemy, to strike at Stalin personally by seizing the city that bore his name. For Stalin, losing it would be unthinkable. The city had to be held at any cost, regardless of the human price. In this collision of egos, geography, and ideology, Stalingrad became destined for destruction. Before the war, Stalingrad had been a sprawling industrial city, home to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Its factories produced tractors, steel, and armaments, contributing directly to Soviet industrial power. The Volga River, wide and slow-moving, served as a vital artery connecting central Russia to the south. Control of the river meant control of transport, supply, and communication across vast regions. Strategically, Stalingrad mattered enormously. Symbolically, it mattered even more. As German bombers appeared in the skies in August 1942, the city's fate was sealed. The Luftwaffe unleashed a devastating air assault, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble in a matter of days. Wooden houses burned uncontrollably, factories were shattered, and thousands of civilians were killed in the initial bombardments alone. Ironically, the destruction that was meant to soften resistance would later become one of the Soviet defenders' greatest advantages. The ruins transformed the city into a maze of broken walls, collapsed stairwells, and underground cellars, terrain perfectly suited for close-quarters defense. As German troops approached the outskirts, Stalin issued one of the most infamous orders of the war, Order Number 227. Not one step back. Retreat without permission was punishable by death. Blocking detachments were positioned behind Soviet lines to enforce discipline, and penal battalions were formed for those accused of cowardice. The message was clear: Stalingrad would be defended not because it could be saved, but because it must not be surrendered. For the soldiers sent into the city, this meant fighting with the knowledge that survival was uncertain and withdrawal impossible. The Red Army poured reinforcements across the Volga under constant German fire. Boats crossed at night, often overloaded, many sinking under artillery shells before reaching the western bank. Those who arrived alive were sometimes sent directly into combat without weapons, instructed to retrieve rifles from fallen comrades. Life expectancy at the front could be measured in hours. Yet, despite horrific losses, the Soviet defense hardened. Every factory floor, apartment block, and sewer tunnel became a battlefield. German commanders were unprepared for this kind of warfare. The blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed armies in open fields were useless in the shattered cityscape. Tanks could not maneuver through rubble-choked streets. Artillery had limited effect against defenders hidden beneath debris. Combat devolved into brutal, intimate encounters. Grenades tossed into rooms, bayonets used in stairwells, and hand-to-hand fighting in darkness. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war, a fight where survival depended on instincts rather than strategy. For Hitler, Stalingrad became an obsession that consumed reason. He demanded constant reports, issued inflexible orders, and refused to allow tactical withdrawals even when German units were exhausted and overstretched. Every street captured was celebrated, every setback dismissed as temporary. Maps in headquarters showed progress measured in meters, not kilometers. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders, including General Vasily Chukov, adopted ruthless defensive tactics. They ordered troops to stay as close as possible to German positions, a strategy known as hugging the enemy. This reduced the effectiveness of German artillery and air power, forcing the fight into close range where Soviet soldiers could exploit their familiarity with the terrain. Civilians who remained trapped in the city endured unimaginable suffering. Many lived in cellars for weeks, surviving on scraps of food and contaminated water. Some worked alongside soldiers, carrying ammunition or tending the wounded. Others simply vanished, buried beneath rubble or killed by shellfire. The line between civilian and combatant blurred until it ceased to exist altogether. Stalingrad became a place where ordinary human distinctions dissolved, replaced by a singular struggle to endure another day. As weeks passed, the city was reduced to a skeletal ruin. Yet the Soviet flag still flew over fragments of ground along the Volga's edge. German forces controlled most of the city, but they never achieved total domination. Every advance was contested, every gain temporary. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. German soldiers, once confident and disciplined, began to show signs of strain, fatigue, despair, and disbelief at the resistance they faced. Soviet soldiers, driven by fear, duty, and a fierce determination to defend their homeland, absorbed losses that would have shattered other armies. By autumn, Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It was a symbol of defiance, a magnet drawing men and resources into a vortex of destruction. Hitler believed that victory there would secure the southern front and break Soviet morale. Stalin believed that holding it would bleed the German army dry. Neither man would relent, and as the ruins smoldered and the Volga flowed quietly beside them, unseen forces were gathering beyond the city's edges, preparing to transform Stalingrad from a brutal battle into a catastrophe that would echo through history. Chapter 2, Segment 3: the illusion of victory and the gathering storm. By early autumn of 1942, the battle for Stalingrad appeared, at least on the surface, to be moving steadily toward a German victory. Maps in Berlin were marked with advancing arrows, reports spoke of captured districts and destroyed Soviet units, and Adolf Hitler became increasingly convinced that the city was on the brink of collapse. From a distance, Stalingrad looked conquered. Nearly 90% of the city lay in German hands. Smoke rose endlessly from shattered factories, apartment blocks, and rail yards. Yet beneath this illusion of triumph, the German Sixth Army was slowly being drained of strength, morale, and time. Every street gained had come at an enormous cost, and every day spent fighting in the ruins brought the Germans closer to a danger they did not yet fully understand. The German High Command underestimated the Red Army's ability to absorb losses and recover. While German divisions bled themselves white in the rubble, Soviet forces beyond the city were rebuilding, reorganizing, and quietly preparing something far larger than a defensive stand. Soviet commanders understood that Stalingrad itself did not need to be retaken immediately. What mattered was destroying the enemy forces committed there. The city had become bait, and the German Sixth Army had taken it completely. German soldiers on the ground sensed that something was wrong. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Ammunition shortages became common. Winter clothing was scarce, as no one in Berlin believed the fighting would last long enough to require it. Reinforcements trickled in slowly, often composed of exhausted units pulled from other fronts. Meanwhile, the flanks of the German advance, guarded by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, were dangerously weak. These Allied units lacked adequate anti-tank weapons, winter gear, and sufficient manpower. Their positions stretched across vast, exposed plains north and south of Stalingrad, far from the brutal urban fighting but crucial to the army's survival. German commanders on the front warned repeatedly that the flanks were vulnerable, but their concerns were ignored. Hitler was fixated on the city itself. Stalingrad had become a personal contest, and he refused to divert resources away from it. Every order emphasized holding ground, advancing block by block, and never retreating. Strategic flexibility vanished under ideological stubbornness. The German war machine, once fluid and adaptive, became rigid and brittle. Inside Stalingrad, the fighting grew more desperate with each passing week. The front lines often ran through single buildings, sometimes even splitting rooms in half. A staircase might be German-controlled by day and Soviet-controlled by night. Snipers turned ruins into killing fields, waiting patiently for the smallest movement. Sleep became rare. Soldiers lived in constant fear, knowing death could come silently from a shattered window or suddenly from a hidden cellar. Casualties mounted relentlessly. German divisions that had once numbered tens of thousands were reduced to a fraction of their strength. Yet despite everything, they kept advancing, driven by orders and the belief that victory was close. On the Soviet side, suffering was no less severe. Entire divisions were annihilated holding small patches of ground. But the Red Army had learned to fight a war of attrition, trading lives for time. Every hour gained allowed Soviet reserves to assemble beyond the Don River. Fresh armies were arriving from Siberia and Central Asia, men hardened by training, better equipped, and kept hidden from German reconnaissance. Massive quantities of artillery, tanks, and supplies were moved into position under strict secrecy. Even as Stalingrad burned, a second, unseen battlefield was forming around it. The Soviet leadership had learned from earlier disasters. This time, they would not rush prematurely. They waited patiently while the Germans exhausted themselves. Soviet intelligence tracked German movements closely, identifying the weakest points along the flanks. Plans were drawn with meticulous detail, coordinating multiple fronts across hundreds of kilometers. The operation was given a name that would soon become legendary: Operation Uranus. It was designed not to retake Stalingrad directly, but to encircle it, to trap the German Sixth Army in a steel ring from which there would be no escape. In the city, neither side could see what was coming. German soldiers believed the Soviets were nearly finished. Soviet defenders believed they were fighting the last stand of their lives. Civilians hiding in cellars had no sense of strategy at all. Only hunger, fear, and exhaustion. The Volga continued to carry supplies and reinforcements under fire, but fewer and fewer boats made the crossing. Winter winds began to cut through the ruins, signaling that the seasons were turning. Snow fell on corpses frozen where they had died, indistinguishable from the rubble around them. By November, the illusion of German victory was complete and dangerously misleading. The Sixth Army was deeply embedded in the city, stretched thin, and utterly dependent on vulnerable supply lines. Its commanders believed they were winning a battle. In reality, they were walking into a trap of historic proportions. When the Soviet counteroffensive finally came, it would not arrive as a sudden surprise from within Stalingrad, but as a thunderous blow from the open plains beyond it. The city that Hitler had become obsessed with was about to transform from a prize into a prison. And the fate of hundreds of thousands of men, along with the direction of the entire war, hung silently in the frozen air, waiting for the storm to break. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Operation Barbarossa reaches the Volga. When German forces crossed into the Soviet Union in June 1941 under the codename Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler believed the campaign would be swift and decisive. The Soviet Union, he assumed, was a fragile state held together by fear, and once struck hard enough, it would collapse under its own weight. In the first months, it seemed he was right. Entire Red Army formations were encircled and destroyed. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. Cities fell one after another as German armored columns surged eastward with terrifying speed. Yet beneath the surface of these victories, the German war effort was already sowing the seeds of its own destruction. Barbarossa had been built on false assumptions: that the Soviet Union would not recover, that logistics could be improvised across vast distances, and that ideological war could be fought like a conventional campaign. By the time German planners began turning their attention south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, the war had already become something far larger and more brutal than anyone in Berlin had anticipated. The Eastern Front was not a single battlefield but an endless expanse of forests, rivers, steppes, and cities, each one consuming men, fuel, ammunition, and time. German supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back toward Europe, vulnerable to weather, partisan attacks, and sheer exhaustion. Trucks broke down. Horses died. Fuel shortages slowed advances that once seemed unstoppable. Yet despite these mounting problems, Hitler made a fateful decision in 1942. Instead of concentrating all forces on Moscow, he would split the German army and drive south toward the Volga River and the oil-rich Caucasus. The goal was not only economic but symbolic. Capturing Stalingrad would cut a vital Soviet transportation artery, cripple industrial production, and deliver a devastating psychological blow by seizing the city that bore Stalin's name. As German forces advanced across southern Russia in the summer of 1942, the landscape itself became an enemy. The vast open steppe offered little cover from the scorching sun. Dust clogged engines and lungs alike. Soldiers marched and fought in temperatures that sapped their strength, while Soviet forces retreated strategically, trading space for time. Villages were abandoned or destroyed. Crops were burned. Bridges were blown. The Red Army, once shattered in open battle, now fought a delaying war designed to draw the Germans deeper into Soviet territory. Each mile gained cost more than the last. Despite this, German commanders remained confident. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was assigned the task of taking Stalingrad. It was a powerful force, well-equipped and experienced, supported by the 4th Panzer Army. On paper, the operation seemed feasible. Soviet resistance appeared disorganized, and intelligence reports suggested that the Red Army was near exhaustion. What these reports failed to capture was the Soviet capacity for mobilization and adaptation. Entire factories were dismantled and moved east beyond the reach of German bombers. New divisions were raised from every corner of the Soviet Union. Civilians were pressed into service, building defenses, digging trenches, and producing weapons under unimaginable conditions. As the Germans pushed toward the Volga, Soviet leadership understood that Stalingrad could not be surrendered easily. The city was a major industrial hub, producing tractors, tanks, and weapons even as bombs fell around it. More importantly, it had become a symbol of resistance. Orders were issued that Stalingrad must be held at all costs. The Volga River itself became a lifeline. Supplies, reinforcements, and wounded were ferried across under constant air attack. Many never made it. Boats were sunk, bodies carried away by the current. Yet the crossings continued day and night. As the Germans approached the city in late summer 1942, they unleashed a devastating aerial bombardment. The Luftwaffe reduced entire districts to rubble, killing tens of thousands of civilians and turning Stalingrad into a smoldering ruin. Streets vanished beneath debris. Buildings collapsed into jagged skeletons of concrete and steel. Fires burned uncontrollably, filling the air with smoke and ash. German commanders believed the bombing had broken Soviet resistance. Instead, it created a battlefield uniquely suited to the defenders. The ruins denied the Germans their advantages in mobility and firepower. Tanks struggled to maneuver. Artillery had limited lines of sight. The fight would no longer be one of sweeping advances, but of brutal, close-quarters combat. For Soviet soldiers, the destruction erased any possibility of retreat. Behind them was the Volga. Ahead of them, the enemy. Stalin's infamous Order Number 227, not one step back, hung over every unit. Blocking detachments stood ready to shoot deserters. Yet despite the fear and coercion, many soldiers fought with genuine determination. They understood that if Stalingrad fell, the road into the heart of the Soviet Union would lie open. As German troops entered the outskirts of the city, the nature of the war changed completely. This was no longer a campaign of movement, but a grinding struggle for survival. Each factory, each apartment block, each pile of rubble became a fortress. Soviet commanders adapted quickly, deploying small assault groups, snipers, and engineers to harass and bleed the advancing Germans. The city swallowed entire battalions, and the closer the Germans came to the Volga, the more violently they were resisted. What had begun as a strategic objective soon became an obsession. Hitler demanded results. Paulus, bound by orders and lacking authority to withdraw, continued to push forward. Both sides poured men into the city without regard for losses. Stalingrad was no longer just a place on a map. It had become the focal point of an entire war. And as the battle intensified, neither side fully grasped that the struggle for the city was only one part of a far greater drama unfolding beyond its shattered streets. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Entering the Inferno, the battle for the city begins. By September 1942, the German Sixth Army stood at the edge of Stalingrad, staring into a city that no longer resembled an urban center, but a scorched labyrinth of ruins, smoke, and death. What had once been wide avenues, factories humming with industry, and neighborhoods filled with life was now a broken landscape where orientation itself became difficult. Maps were useless within hours, as buildings marked on them had been reduced to rubble or erased entirely. For the German soldiers advancing into the city, Stalingrad did not feel like a conquest waiting to happen. It felt like a trap slowly closing around them. The Luftwaffe's relentless bombing campaign had flattened much of the city, but it had failed to destroy its defenders. Instead, it created endless hiding places for Soviet soldiers who now waited among the ruins with rifles, machine guns, grenades, and an unyielding determination. The German advance began with confidence. Infantry units moved forward supported by tanks and artillery, expecting organized resistance to crumble quickly. But the Soviets had adapted their tactics with ruthless efficiency. Rather than forming continuous defensive lines, they clung to key strongpoints, factories, apartment blocks, basements, stairwells, sewer tunnels, turning every structure into a miniature battlefield. The distance between enemy positions shrank to mere meters. Often, German and Soviet troops occupied different floors of the same building, fighting each other through ceilings and walls. Combat became intensely personal. Grenades were thrown blindly around corners. Bayonets and entrenching tools were used when ammunition ran out. Night offered no relief, as flares illuminated the ruins and sudden counterattacks erupted without warning. German soldiers began to refer to the fighting as Rattenkrieg, Rat War, a brutal struggle in dark, confined spaces where survival depended on instincts rather than strategy. The Volga River loomed constantly in the background, visible from many parts of the city, yet frustratingly out of reach for the Germans. Soviet forces clung to a narrow strip of land along its western bank, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide. Every night, under artillery fire and Luftwaffe attacks, Soviet boats crossed the river carrying reinforcements and supplies. Many were destroyed mid-crossing, yet enough made it through to sustain the defense. Wounded soldiers were evacuated eastward while fresh units, often poorly trained but fiercely motivated, were ferried west to replace them. Entire regiments were sometimes wiped out within days of arriving, yet the flow never stopped. To the Soviet command, Stalingrad was not just another city, it was the line that must not break. Stalin personally monitored the battle, issuing orders that emphasized endurance over maneuver. Soviet generals like Vasily Chukov embraced a doctrine of close combat, instructing their men to stay as close to the Germans as possible to negate their superiority in artillery and air power. "Hug the enemy," Chukov famously ordered. The closer the fighting, the less effective German firepower became. Factories turned into fortresses. The Red October Steel Factory, the Barikadi Gun Factory, and the Tractor Factory became legendary killing grounds. Control of these sites shifted back and forth repeatedly, sometimes changing hands several times in a single day. Workers who had once built tanks now fought alongside soldiers, using whatever weapons they could find. In some cases, tanks rolled directly off factory lines and into combat, barely painted, crewed by men with only minutes of training. German losses mounted steadily. Units that had been hardened veterans of earlier campaigns began to break down under the strain. Supplies were increasingly scarce. Ammunition deliveries were disrupted. Casualties overwhelmed medical services. Replacement troops lacked experience in urban combat and were thrown into the fight with little preparation. Despite these problems, Hitler refused to allow any withdrawal. Stalingrad had become a matter of prestige, and prestige mattered more than practicality. Paulus, trapped between the reality on the ground and the demands from Berlin, continued to press forward, committing more forces into the ruins. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. Soldiers fought surrounded by corpses, often unable to bury the dead. The stench of decay mixed with smoke and dust, clinging to clothing and skin. Sleep came in short, exhausted bursts, interrupted by shell fire and sudden attacks. Fear became constant yet strangely numbing. Many soldiers described feeling detached from reality, functioning on instinct alone. Snipers added another layer of terror. Soviet marksmen, often operating in pairs, dominated key areas of the city. Hidden among rubble and ruins, they targeted officers, machine gun crews, and anyone who exposed themselves even briefly. German soldiers learned to move cautiously, hugging walls, avoiding open spaces. Some refused to move at all in daylight. The sniper war became a battle of patience and nerves, immortalized later in Soviet propaganda but experienced at the time as a relentless psychological assault. Civilians who remained in the city endured unimaginable suffering. Thousands lived in cellars without adequate food or water, emerging only at night to search for scraps. Many were killed by shelling or caught in the crossfire. Others were pressed into labor, helping build defenses or carry supplies. For them, survival depended on luck as much as courage. By October 1942, the Germans had captured most of Stalingrad, yet victory remained elusive. The Soviets still held pockets of resistance along the Volga, refusing to collapse. Each German gain came at an unsustainable cost. The Sixth Army was bleeding itself dry, trapped in a battle of attrition it could not win. Unbeknownst to many German soldiers fighting in the ruins, a far more dangerous threat was gathering beyond the city. While the Germans focused on taking Stalingrad street by street, Soviet forces were massing on the flanks, preparing a counteroffensive that would change the course of the war. The battle for the city was reaching its most intense phase, but it was also setting the stage for a catastrophe that would soon engulf the entire German army in the south. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Rattenkrieg without end: life, death, and madness in the ruins of Stalingrad. By late October 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had descended into a state of warfare unlike anything previously experienced in modern history. A grinding nightmare where the concept of a front line ceased to exist and the city itself became the battlefield. The Germans and Soviets were now locked in a perpetual struggle measured not in kilometers, but in rooms, staircases, cellars, and piles of shattered brick. A single building might be fought over for days, only to change hands multiple times within hours. Soldiers no longer spoke of advances or retreats. Instead, they spoke of holding a wall, losing a floor, or clearing a basement. This was the essence of Rattenkrieg, the Rat War, where survival depended on reflexes, luck, and the ability to endure conditions that shattered both body and mind. The ruins of Stalingrad offered endless concealment. Craters filled with debris became fighting positions. Collapsed factories formed mazes of twisted metal and concrete where sound echoed unpredictably, making it impossible to tell where an enemy attack might come from. German units often advanced cautiously, only to be ambushed at point-blank range by Soviet soldiers who had waited silently for hours. Close combat became inevitable. Rifles were used as clubs. Knives and bayonets were drawn in dark corridors. Hand grenades were exchanged almost casually, tossed into doorways and holes in the rubble with little warning. The constant proximity of the enemy eroded nerves. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that death could come from a hole in the wall, a ceiling above, or a cellar beneath their feet. The psychological strain was immense. Men who had survived months of conventional warfare broke down in the city, unable to cope with the relentless tension. Some froze in place under fire. Others lashed out recklessly, exposing themselves to sniper shots. The Soviet defenders, though suffering equally, derived grim strength from the fact that they were fighting for their homeland. Political officers reinforced discipline harshly, sometimes executing deserters on the spot, but many soldiers needed no coercion. For them, retreat meant the Volga at their backs and annihilation beyond it. German soldiers, by contrast, were fighting far from home, increasingly isolated, and haunted by the sense that the battle had no clear purpose beyond Hitler's pride. Supplies deteriorated rapidly. Food arrived irregularly, often cold and insufficient. Ammunition shortages forced units to ration bullets, making every shot count. Medical care was primitive. Wounded men lay for hours or days in rubble-strewn aid stations, many dying from infections or blood loss before they could be evacuated. The Soviets fared little better. Their reinforcements were frequently rushed across the Volga under fire, thrown into combat with minimal equipment. Entire battalions were sometimes reduced to a handful of survivors within days. Yet still they fought. The factories became symbols of resistance. The Red October factory was contested so fiercely that parts of it were nicknamed after their daily casualty rates. The Barricadi factory turned into a fortress of steel and smoke, where artillery pieces were fired at point-blank range against German infantry. The tractor factory, once a symbol of Soviet industrial pride, became a charnel house where tanks and bodies lay smashed together in tangled heaps. Even when the Germans technically captured these sites, Soviet counterattacks erupted almost immediately, often at night, reclaiming ground at terrible cost. Snipers continued to stalk the ruins, transforming fear into a constant companion. A careless movement, a glint of metal, a silhouette against the sky could mean instant death. The famous duels between snipers were only a small part of a much larger phenomenon. Hundreds of marksmen operated independently, targeting officers, radio operators, and anyone who appeared to be in command. German morale suffered deeply as leadership figures were picked off with unnerving precision. Civilians remained trapped in the city, living in conditions barely distinguishable from the battlefield itself. Families huddled in basements without heat as winter approached, surviving on scraps of food and melted snow. Children learned to recognize the sounds of incoming shells. Many civilians were killed accidentally or deliberately, caught in the crossfire or executed as suspected partisans. For them, there was no concept of victory or defeat, only endurance. As November approached, the weather began to turn. Cold winds swept through the ruins, carrying snow and freezing rain. Soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite became common, compounding wounds and exhaustion. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Vehicles broke down. The suffering intensified, yet the fighting did not slow. Both sides were now locked into a brutal logic. To stop fighting was to die. Above all of this loomed the strategic blindness of the German command. Hitler continued to demand the capture of Stalingrad at all costs, refusing to acknowledge that the Sixth Army was being ground down beyond recovery. Paulus, obedient and cautious, followed orders even as his officers warned of impending disaster. Unknown to most German soldiers, Soviet forces were quietly assembling massive reserves on the flanks north and south of the city. While the Germans poured men into the ruins, the Soviets prepared something far larger. A counteroffensive designed not to reclaim the city, but to annihilate the entire German army trapped within it. In the shattered streets of Stalingrad, neither side yet knew it, but the battle was nearing its decisive turning point. The Rat War had consumed the city, drained the Sixth Army of its strength, and set the conditions for one of the most devastating encirclements in military history. Chapter 4, Segment 1, Operation Uranus, the storm that changed the war. As the battle inside Stalingrad raged through October and early November 1942, the German Sixth Army remained fixated on the shattered city along the Volga, convinced that final victory was only a matter of time. Street by street, room by room, German troops continued to bleed themselves against stubborn Soviet resistance, unaware that the true danger no longer lay within the ruins they fought over, but far beyond them. While Paulus concentrated his forces inside the city, the Red Army was quietly preparing a vast counteroffensive on the open steppe to the north and south, where the German flanks were held not by elite divisions, but by overstretched Axis allies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units poorly equipped for modern mechanized warfare and ill-prepared for a Soviet assault of unprecedented scale. This plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was not designed to retake Stalingrad directly. It aimed instead to encircle and destroy the entire Sixth Army, turning Hitler's greatest gamble into one of history's most catastrophic defeats. Soviet commanders Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had learned from earlier failures. This time, they massed overwhelming force in secrecy, moving hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, artillery pieces, and supplies under the cover of darkness and deception. Dummy troop movements were staged near Moscow to mislead German intelligence, while radio silence masked the true buildup near the Don River. Snow fell across the steppe, concealing tracks and softening the ground, while German reconnaissance flights, limited by weather and fuel shortages, failed to detect the looming threat. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the silence shattered. At dawn, a thunderous artillery barrage erupted along the northern flank of the German Sixth Army, smashing into the Romanian Third Army positioned along the Don. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously, sending shockwaves across the frozen plains. Trenches collapsed, communication lines were severed, and entire units were stunned into chaos. Moments later, Soviet tank and infantry formations surged forward, cutting through defenses that had neither the anti-tank weapons nor the manpower to stop them. Romanian soldiers fought bravely in places, but their lines crumbled under the sheer weight of the assault. By midday, Soviet armor was advancing deep into the rear areas, overrunning headquarters, supply depots, and airfields. 2 days later, on November 20th, a second massive offensive struck the southern flank, smashing the Romanian Fourth Army guarding the approaches south of Stalingrad. Once again, the attack followed the same devastating pattern: artillery saturation, armored breakthrough, and rapid exploitation. German reserves were scarce, scattered, and too weak to stem the tide. Within days, Soviet pincers were racing toward each other, driving relentlessly through snow-covered fields and shattered villages. Panic spread among Axis troops as reports of encirclement multiplied. German officers pleaded for permission to withdraw the Sixth Army while escape was still possible, but Hitler refused. He insisted Stalingrad be held at all costs, believing the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped forces by air until a relief operation arrived. This decision would seal the fate of more than 250,000 men. On November 23, 1942, near the town of Kalach, Soviet spearheads from the north and south met, closing the encirclement around Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was trapped. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army had been surrounded on such a massive scale. Inside the pocket, confusion and disbelief reigned. Many German soldiers could not comprehend what had happened. They had been fighting for weeks inside ruins, unaware that the front behind them had collapsed. Suddenly, the Volga, once a symbol of stubborn Soviet resistance, became irrelevant. The true battlefield now lay in the open fields beyond reach. Supplies dwindled rapidly. Ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies fell far short of what was needed to sustain the encircled army. Wounded men filled makeshift hospitals, while frostbite and disease spread unchecked. The Luftwaffe's promised airlift proved hopelessly inadequate. Planes were shot down, grounded by weather, or simply too few in number to meet demand. Entire units went days without food. Morale collapsed as reality set in. The belief in German invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, shattered in the frozen cauldron of Stalingrad. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened the ring, pushing inward with methodical determination. They no longer rushed headlong into the city ruins. Instead, they applied pressure, conserving strength and waiting for starvation and cold to do their work. Political officers and commanders framed the encirclement as a moment of historical justice, a turning point where the invader would finally pay for the devastation inflicted upon Soviet soil. Across the Eastern Front, news of the encirclement spread quickly. For the first time, Germany's allies and enemies alike sensed that the war had changed. Stalingrad was no longer just a city. It had become a symbol of reversal, proof that the Wehrmacht could be defeated, surrounded, and destroyed. Operation Uranus marked the moment when the initiative on the Eastern Front began to shift decisively to the Red Army. The trap had closed, and inside it, the fate of the Sixth Army, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Encirclement and Illusion, the Sixth Army Trapped. Inside the newly sealed pocket around Stalingrad, the reality of encirclement unfolded with brutal speed, even as the German high command clung to illusions that would prove fatal. When news reached General Friedrich Paulus that Soviet forces had linked up at Kalach, fully cutting off the Sixth Army, his staff immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Maps were redrawn, supply calculations reassessed, and grim conclusions reached. Without an immediate breakout to the west, the army could not survive the winter. Yet Paulus was bound by Hitler's direct orders, reinforced daily from the Führer's headquarters, forbidding any retreat. Stalingrad, Hitler insisted, must be held as a fortress, its symbolic value outweighing all military logic. Hermann Göring compounded the delusion by promising that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army entirely by air, a claim that ignored basic arithmetic and the realities of winter weather, enemy fire, and limited aircraft availability. To sustain the Sixth Army, more than 600 tons of supplies were needed each day. At best, the Luftwaffe delivered a fraction of that amount, often less than 100 tons, and sometimes nothing at all. Airfields inside the pocket, such as Potomnik and Gumrak, were under constant artillery fire, choked with snow, and increasingly unusable. Transport planes were shot down or crash-landed, while wounded men desperate for evacuation fought for space aboard departing aircraft. As November turned to December, the encircled troops began to starve. Bread rations were cut repeatedly until they amounted to little more than a few frozen crumbs. Horse meat, once used sparingly, became a primary food source, and eventually even that disappeared. Fuel shortages meant vehicles were abandoned, artillery fell silent, and wounded soldiers froze where they lay. Frostbite spread rapidly, claiming fingers, toes, and limbs, while typhus and dysentery flourished in the overcrowded, filthy conditions. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia, and amputations became routine acts of survival rather than healing. Despite the mounting catastrophe, official communications from Berlin continued to speak of relief, resilience, and honor. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal in late January, a clear signal that surrender was unacceptable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was unmistakable. Paulus was expected to die rather than capitulate. Meanwhile, the Soviet high command watched patiently. Having achieved encirclement, they resisted the temptation to rush the final destruction. Instead, Soviet forces consolidated their positions, strengthened the ring, and prepared to crush any breakout attempt. German hopes briefly flared in December with Operation Winterstorm, a relief effort led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His armored forces pushed eastward from the Kotelnikovo area and came within roughly 50 kilometers of the encircled Sixth Army. Inside the pocket, many officers urged Paulus to break out and meet Manstein halfway. The opportunity, though slim, was real. But once again, Hitler refused. Paulus was ordered to hold his ground, trusting that Manstein would reach him. The relief attempt stalled under fierce Soviet resistance, and the last realistic chance of escape vanished into the snow. As December wore on, the encirclement tightened. Soviet artillery crept closer, pounding German positions relentlessly, while snipers and patrols harassed exhausted defenders. The pocket shrank steadily, dividing into smaller, more vulnerable sectors. Entire regiments ceased to exist as cohesive units. Discipline eroded as hunger and despair overwhelmed military structure. Soldiers wrote final letters home, knowing they would never be sent. Others wandered aimlessly through ruins and snowdrifts, numbed by cold and resignation. Yet even in this abyss, the machinery of command continued to function in distorted form. Orders were issued, reports compiled, and positions defended long after their strategic value had evaporated. For the Soviet soldiers surrounding the pocket, the encirclement represented both triumph and grim duty. They too endured harsh winter conditions, heavy casualties, and constant strain, but morale was buoyed by the knowledge that the invader was finally trapped. Propaganda units documented the slow strangulation of the Sixth Army, while commanders prepared the final offensive that would annihilate the pocket piece by piece. The encirclement of Stalingrad was not merely a military maneuver. It was a psychological collapse played out over weeks of starvation, freezing temperatures, and false hope. It exposed the fatal consequences of ideological rigidity overriding operational reality, and it shattered the myth of German invulnerability that had dominated Europe since the war's beginning. By the end of December 1942, the fate of the Sixth Army was no longer in doubt. What remained was only the question of how long the suffering would continue, and how history would remember the men trapped inside the frozen ring around Stalingrad. Chapter 4, Segment 3, The Frozen Cauldron Collapse from Within. As January 1943 began, the encircled Sixth Army existed no longer as a fighting force in the conventional sense, but as a mass of starving, freezing men trapped inside what German soldiers themselves now called Der Kessel, the cauldron. The illusion of relief had evaporated, replaced by the grinding certainty of annihilation. Temperatures plunged well below -20 degrees Celsius, and with fuel almost completely gone, there was no heat, no movement, and no escape from the cold. Soldiers wrapped rags around their feet where boots had disintegrated, while frostbite claimed thousands each week. Weapons froze solid, machine guns jammed, and artillery pieces sat useless, half buried in snow. The Luftwaffe's airlift, once trumpeted as salvation, had collapsed into near irrelevance. Soviet anti-aircraft fire intensified, airfields were overrun or rendered unusable, and transport aircraft fell from the sky in flames or crash-landed into frozen fields. The wounded piled up in makeshift shelters, many left untreated, lying shoulder to shoulder in cellars and bunkers that stank of blood, decay, and despair. Surgeons worked with bare hands, dull saws, and no anesthesia, amputating limbs in a desperate effort to prevent gangrene, while knowing that many patients would die regardless. Hunger became the army's most relentless enemy. Daily rations were reduced to a few ounces of bread mixed with sawdust, sometimes accompanied by thin soup made from melted snow and scraps of horse hide. Soldiers scavenged the ruins for anything remotely edible, boiling leather belts, saddles, and even pages from books. Discipline collapsed under the weight of starvation. Officers could no longer enforce orders when men lacked the strength to stand. Entire units disintegrated as soldiers drifted away in search of warmth or food, never to return. Morale, once sustained by notions of duty and victory, gave way to numb resignation. Many soldiers ceased speaking altogether, conserving energy, staring silently into space as the war narrowed to the next hour, the next breath. Meanwhile, Soviet forces prepared the final act with methodical precision. Rather than rushing the German lines, Red Army commanders chose to grind the pocket down systematically. Artillery barrages thundered day and night, shattering remaining defenses and collapsing buildings onto the men sheltering inside. Infantry units advanced block by block, clearing cellars, factories, and trenches with grenades and flamethrowers. Each advance reduced the pocket further, splitting the encircled Germans into smaller groups that could no longer support one another. By mid-January, the Sixth Army was effectively cut in two, north and south, severing communication and coordination. General Paulus, now promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in a final, grim gesture, understood the message clearly. Surrender was forbidden. Yet the reality on the ground made obedience meaningless. Paulus's headquarters itself was little more than a frozen bunker beneath the ruins, its staff reduced to exhausted clerks issuing orders to units that no longer existed. Radio messages to Berlin grew increasingly detached from reality, reporting continued resistance, while entire divisions had already vanished. Hitler's commands arrived unchanged: hold positions, fight to the last, but they might as well have come from another world. For the Soviet soldiers closing in, the sight of their enemy was shocking even to men hardened by years of war. German prisoners stumbled forward wrapped in rags, skeletal, barely able to speak, their faces gray with exhaustion and hunger. Many collapsed immediately after capture, some dying within hours despite medical care. Soviet medics and guards struggled to process the sheer number of prisoners, while propaganda officers documented the collapse as proof that the once-feared Wehrmacht could be broken. On January 26th, Soviet forces linked up within the city, splitting the pocket completely and sealing the fate of the Sixth Army. The northern group, surrounded and battered beyond endurance, surrendered first. The southern group, containing Paulus's headquarters, held out a few days longer, though resistance was now symbolic rather than real. On January 31, 1943, Friedrich Paulus surrendered his remaining forces in the southern pocket, defying Hitler's expectations and marking the first time a German field marshal had capitulated. The northern remnants surrendered shortly afterward, on February 2nd. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the more than 250,000 Axis troops originally encircled, only around 90,000 went into captivity, and fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The frozen ruins of Stalingrad bore witness to one of history's greatest military catastrophes, not only in terms of loss of life, but in the shattering of an ideology that had promised invincibility. The collapse of the Sixth Army was more than a defeat. It was a psychological turning point that echoed far beyond the Volga, signaling to the world that Nazi Germany could be stopped, broken, and ultimately destroyed. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The Volga Lifeline: Survival Under Fire. While the frozen ruins of Stalingrad became synonymous with death and destruction, the battle's survival hinged on a narrow ribbon of water flowing through the chaos: the Volga River. Long before the encirclement of the Sixth Army, and even before the streets dissolved into rubble and ash, the Volga had already become one of the most dangerous supply routes in military history. For the Soviet defenders clinging to the western bank, the river was not merely a geographic feature. It was the thin line between existence and annihilation. Every rifle, every shell, every loaf of bread, and every replacement soldier had to cross that water under constant enemy fire. From the summer of 1942 onward, German artillery observers dominated the heights overlooking the river, while Luftwaffe aircraft patrolled the skies, turning the Volga into a killing zone by day. Barges, ferries, fishing boats, and even makeshift rafts were shredded by bombs and shells, sending men and supplies into the dark water below. Yet despite staggering losses, the crossings never stopped. Soviet commanders understood that to abandon the Volga crossings was to surrender the city itself, and with it the psychological heart of the war. At night, when German aircraft were less effective, the river came alive with movement. Boats slipped across in near silence, engines muffled, oars wrapped in cloth, navigated by memory and instinct rather than light. Many pilots and sailors were barely trained. Factory workers, teenagers, and old fishermen pressed into service, Yet they returned trip after trip, knowing each crossing might be their last. The riverbanks were scenes of relentless urgency. Wounded men staggered down to be evacuated eastward, while fresh troops, many with little more than rifles and a handful of ammunition, climbed aboard boats heading west into the inferno. Often, the wounded and the living crossed paths in silence, sharing brief glances that conveyed more than words ever could. Medical evacuations were chaotic and brutal. Stretchers were stacked wherever space allowed, blood freezing into dark crusts on uniforms, while doctors triaged on the spot, deciding who might survive the crossing and who would not. Many wounded never made it across. Boats hit by shells sank within seconds, trapping men beneath ice-cold water, weighed down by equipment and injuries. The Volga claimed thousands of lives without ever appearing in official casualty reports. Food shortages in the city were constant and severe. Rations were minimal, sometimes little more than a few ounces of bread per day, and distribution was erratic, dependent entirely on whether supplies survived the crossing. Soldiers learned to fight on empty stomachs, conserving energy, moving slowly, and sleeping whenever possible. Civilians trapped in the city fared even worse. Entire families hid in basements and cellars, sharing scraps of food, melting snow for water, and venturing out only under cover of darkness to search for anything edible. Children became messengers and scavengers, darting through ruins that even seasoned soldiers feared. Despite this suffering, the Volga crossings became a powerful symbol of defiance. Soviet propaganda celebrated the river as a lifeline of heroism, but behind the slogans lay a stark reality. Survival depended on discipline, endurance, and an acceptance of loss on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Commanders rotated units across the river whenever possible, though many soldiers crossed only once, knowing they would never return. The phrase, "There is no land beyond the Volga," was more than rhetoric. It was an order, a warning, and a psychological weapon meant to harden resolve. Retreat was not an option. The river marked the final boundary. German forces, aware of the river's importance, attempted repeatedly to sever the crossings. Artillery barges were timed to coincide with peak ferry movements, while dive bombers targeted docks and staging areas. Yet the destruction only forced adaptation. When docks were destroyed, soldiers loaded boats from rubble-strewn banks. When large vessels became too visible, smaller boats replaced them. When engines failed, oars were used. Improvisation became doctrine, and survival depended on flexibility rather than planning. As the battle intensified into autumn and winter, ice began forming along the Volga's surface, creating new dangers and opportunities. Boats struggled through slush and broken ice, while soldiers sometimes crawled across partially frozen sections under cover of darkness, risking drowning if the ice gave way. By late November, the river itself began to freeze solid, transforming the lifeline once again. What had been a watery gauntlet became a frozen highway, still deadly, still exposed, but now capable of supporting trucks, artillery, and mass movement. This transformation coincided with the Soviet counteroffensive, allowing greater logistical freedom just as the German Sixth Army became trapped. In retrospect, the Volga crossings were not merely a logistical feat but a moral one. They embodied the Soviet refusal to abandon Stalingrad, even when logic suggested withdrawal. Every successful crossing reinforced the belief that endurance itself was a weapon, that survival could be an act of resistance. The river carried more than supplies and soldiers. It carried resolve, fear, hope, and the unspoken understanding that the fate of the war flowed with its currents. Without the Volga lifeline, Stalingrad would have fallen long before the encirclement, and the course of the Second World War might have taken a very different path. Chapter 5, Segment 2. Survival on the Edge: Civilians, Supply, and the Human Will. As the Volga continued to serve as Stalingrad's fragile artery, Life on the Western Bank descended into a state that blurred the line between civilian and soldier, survival and surrender. By late summer and into the brutal autumn of 1942, the city had ceased to function as an urban space in any recognizable sense. What remained was a shattered landscape of concrete, steel, and smoke, inhabited by tens of thousands of civilians who had not escaped before the siege closed in. These people, women, children, the elderly, became unwilling participants in one of history's most merciless battles. Many lived underground, in cellars carved out beneath collapsed apartment blocks or factory floors, where darkness and dampness became constant companions. Air raids and artillery fire shook the earth above them day and night, collapsing entrances, suffocating entire families, or burying them alive without warning. Hunger was relentless. Food supplies meant for civilians had long since vanished, and survival depended on scavenging burned-out warehouses, abandoned German rations, or whatever could be salvaged from the ruins. Flour mixed with sawdust, soup made from boiled leather, and bread rationed in crumbs became daily realities. Water, often drawn from shell holes or melted snow, carried disease, and outbreaks of dysentery and typhus spread rapidly in the overcrowded underground shelters. Yet despite this suffering, civilians were not passive victims. Many became essential to the city's defense. Women carried ammunition across open ground, repaired uniforms, treated wounded soldiers, and worked in makeshift hospitals with little more than rags and hope. Children acted as runners, messengers, and scavengers, their small size allowing them to slip through rubble-strewn passages unseen by enemy snipers. Entire families took part in constructing barricades, reinforcing firing positions, and camouflaging defensive lines with debris. Factories that had not been completely destroyed continued to operate under impossible conditions. In the ruins of the Red October and Barricadi factories, workers assembled tanks and weapons even as shells crashed through the walls and ceilings. Machinery was moved into basements and trenches. Shifts were organized around bombardments rather than clocks. It was not uncommon for workers to build a tank during the day and watch it roll directly into combat before nightfall. These acts were celebrated by Soviet propaganda, but for those involved, they were driven less by ideology than by a simple understanding. If the city fell, there would be no future at all. The psychological strain of constant danger was immense. Sleep came in brief, shallow intervals, interrupted by explosions, screams, and the roar of aircraft. Fear became a permanent condition, yet it also transformed into something else, a hardened numbness that allowed people to function amid horrors that would otherwise have shattered the human mind. Soldiers and civilians alike spoke of time losing meaning, of days blending together into an endless cycle of survival tasks. Find food, avoid shells, tend the wounded, prepare for the next attack. For Soviet troops holding the riverbank, supplies were never sufficient. Ammunition shortages forced units to share weapons, pass rifles from the dead to the living, and conserve every bullet. Orders emphasized close-quarters combat, grenades, knives, bayonets, where German advantages in artillery and armor could be neutralized. This brutal intimacy of fighting further blurred moral boundaries, turning buildings into personal battlefields where survival depended on instinct and ruthlessness. Meanwhile, the constant movement across the Volga shaped the emotional rhythm of the city. Each night brought the sound of engines, oars, and whispered commands as boats arrived and departed. For those waiting to be evacuated, wounded soldiers, sick civilians, the sight of a ferry was a fragile promise of survival. For those arriving, it was a passage into hell. Many veterans later described the crossing as the moment they truly understood what awaited them, watching the city burn against the night sky while shells burst along the riverbanks. Yet even as losses mounted, morale did not collapse. Soviet command recognized the importance of symbolism and psychology. reinforcing the idea that holding even a few meters of ground was a victory in itself. Defensive positions were named Pavlov's house, the nail factory, the tennis racket, turning anonymous ruins into symbols of resistance. These names spread through the ranks, reinforcing a sense of shared struggle and purpose. The Volga lifeline thus sustained more than bodies. It sustained belief. Every successful crossing, every crate of ammunition unloaded under fire, every wounded man carried back across the river reinforced the idea that endurance was possible, that survival itself was a form of defiance. German commanders, frustrated by their inability to sever the river traffic completely, underestimated the psychological power of this persistence. They measured success in territory gained and enemies killed, failing to grasp that the Soviet defense was not aimed at victory in the conventional sense, but at survival long enough to change the course of the war. As autumn turned toward winter, the human cost of the Volga crossings became staggering. Thousands drowned, burned, or froze in the attempt to sustain the city, their names lost to history, their sacrifices absorbed into the larger narrative of Stalingrad's suffering. Yet without them, the defense would have collapsed. The river, indifferent and relentless, carried both life and death, reflecting the brutal reality of the battle it sustained. In this crucible of endurance, Stalingrad became more than a city. It became a testament to how far human beings could be pushed and still refuse to surrender. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Steel, Smoke, and the Breaking Point, the battle hardens. By the time autumn fully gripped Stalingrad, the battle had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of warfare. A grinding contest of endurance where progress was measured not in kilometers but in stairwells, corridors, and piles of shattered brick. The German Sixth Army, once confident of a swift victory, now found itself locked in a struggle that defied traditional military logic. Each ruined building became a fortress, each basement a bunker, each factory floor a killing zone. Soviet defenders perfected a style of combat that came to be known as Rattenkrieg, rat war, a term coined by the Germans to describe the claustrophobic, close-range fighting that turned Stalingrad into a maze of death. In this environment, tanks were nearly useless, artillery fire was dangerously imprecise, and air superiority offered limited advantage. Victory belonged to whoever could endure the longest in the rubble. German infantry units advanced cautiously, often capturing the ground floor of a building only to be attacked from above, below, and behind by Soviet troops who had memorized every crack and passageway. Entire days of fighting could be consumed by the struggle for a single room. Hand grenades, submachine guns, bayonets, and sharpened entrenching tools became the primary weapons. Soldiers learned to sleep in short bursts, fully armed, their nerves stretched to the breaking point by constant alerts and sudden explosions. Casualties mounted relentlessly, and replacements, often poorly trained, were thrown into combat with minimal preparation, many surviving only hours. For the Soviets, the strategy was brutally simple. Deny the Germans the ability to regroup or rest. Small assault groups operated independently, launching sudden counterattacks at night, infiltrating enemy-held positions through sewer systems, shell holes, and collapsed walls. This constant pressure shattered German morale. Men who had survived France and the early months of Operation Barbarossa now spoke openly of fear, exhaustion, and despair. Letters home described Stalingrad not as a battle, but as a nightmare from which there was no escape. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Field hospitals, often set up in ruined buildings or underground shelters, struggled to cope with the scale of injuries. Surgeons worked without anesthesia, amputating limbs by candlelight as shells shook the walls around them. Infection spread rapidly, and many wounded never made it back across the Volga, dying where they fell or being buried hastily beneath rubble. The distinction between front line and rear area vanished entirely. There was no safe zone in Stalingrad. Even command posts were targeted relentlessly, forcing officers to operate from cellars and trenches, often cut off from reliable communication. German commanders grew increasingly frustrated with orders from above that failed to reflect the reality on the ground. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with capturing the city that bore Stalin's name, repeatedly forbade tactical withdrawals, demanding that every position be held at all costs. This inflexibility proved disastrous. Units that might have been rotated or reinforced were instead bled white, trapped in exposed positions with dwindling supplies. Ammunition shortages became acute, and the German logistical system, already strained by distance and partisan activity, struggled to keep pace with the demands of urban warfare. Fuel, food, and medical supplies arrived late or not at all. Soldiers resorted to scavenging from the dead, both enemy and their own. Meanwhile, Soviet losses were equally staggering. Entire divisions were destroyed defending narrow strips of land along the Volga. New units were rushed into battle with little more than rifles and determination, often crossing the river under fire with the knowledge that retreat was impossible. Political officers reinforced this reality, reminding troops that there was no land beyond the Volga. Yet, despite the brutality of discipline and the scale of sacrifice, the defense held. Factories that were reduced to ruins became legendary strongholds. At the Barricade and Red October plants, fighting raged among twisted machinery and shattered assembly lines. Where molten metal still cooled on the floors and rail cars lay overturned like broken toys. Control of these sites shifted back and forth repeatedly, sometimes several times in a single day. Maps became obsolete almost as soon as they were drawn. The environment itself became a weapon. Dust and smoke choked the air, reducing visibility to a few meters. Fires burned unchecked, consuming oxygen and spreading panic. The smell of death, bodies decomposing beneath rubble, blood soaked into the ground, hung over the city like a permanent fog. For many soldiers, this sensory overload left lasting psychological scars. Veterans later recalled hearing phantom explosions, feeling the ground tremble beneath their feet long after the battle had ended. As October drew to a close, it became clear that Stalingrad was no longer merely a military objective. It had transformed into a symbol, a test of will that neither side could abandon without catastrophic consequences. For the Germans, retreat would mean admitting failure after months of sacrifice. For the Soviets, defeat would open the Volga and threaten the heart of the nation's war effort. Both sides continued to pour men into the city, feeding a battle that consumed lives at an industrial scale. Yet beneath the surface of this relentless struggle, something subtle but decisive was beginning to shift. The German advance slowed to a crawl, their strength steadily eroded by attrition. Soviet commanders, watching and waiting, recognized that the enemy had overextended itself. The city that was meant to be captured quickly had become a trap, drawing in the Sixth Army and grinding it down piece by piece. As winter approached, Stalingrad stood battered but unbroken, its defenders clinging to the riverbank, its ruins soaked in blood. The battle had reached a breaking point, not just of buildings and armies, but of human endurance itself. What followed would change the course of the war forever. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Volga Lifeline, holding the river at all costs. As the battle for Stalingrad dragged into its most desperate phase, the Volga River emerged as both a lifeline and a death sentence, a narrow ribbon of water separating survival from annihilation. For the Soviet defenders trapped along the western bank, the Volga was the only remaining artery through which men, weapons, food, and hope could flow into the city. For the Germans, it was a barrier that had to be severed at all costs, a final obstacle standing between them and total victory. Day and night, under constant artillery fire and Luftwaffe bombing, Soviet ferries, barges, and small boats crossed the river, carrying reinforcements into hell and evacuating the wounded back across waters choked with debris and corpses. Many of these crossings were made at night, when darkness offered a fragile shield from German aircraft. Yet even then, flares turned the river into a glowing corridor of death. Boats were hit, capsized, or torn apart midstream, spilling soldiers into icy water where few survived. Those who reached the western bank often jumped directly into combat, barely given time to orient themselves before being thrown into the ruins. Commanders understood that the Volga crossings were unsustainable in the long term, yet there was no alternative. Without constant reinforcement, the defenders would be overwhelmed. Without evacuation, the wounded would die where they lay. The river thus became a conveyor belt of sacrifice, endlessly feeding the front line with human lives. On the eastern bank, Soviet logistics officers worked under impossible conditions, coordinating supplies with limited resources, often improvising routes and schedules as bombardments destroyed docks and landing points. Ammunition shortages were chronic. Soldiers sometimes received only a handful of bullets before being sent into battle, instructed to take weapons from fallen comrades. Food rations were meager, consisting of bread, thin soup, or whatever could be scavenged. Hunger gnawed constantly, weakening bodies already exhausted by combat and exposure. Yet, despite these conditions, morale among many Soviet units remained astonishingly resilient. The knowledge that retreat was impossible, reinforced by orders and the physical barrier of the river itself, forged a grim determination. Every meter of ground became sacred. Defensive positions were layered vertically rather than horizontally. Upper floors, basements, rubble piles, allowing small groups to hold off much larger forces. Snipers, operating from concealed positions, turned German movement into a lethal gamble. Figures like Vasily Zaitsev became symbols of resistance, though thousands of unnamed marksmen contributed to the same deadly effect, forcing German troops to move cautiously, heads down, nerves frayed. The psychological toll on the attackers was immense. German soldiers spoke of the Volga as an ever-present threat, a reminder that the enemy could not be fully crushed as long as the river remained open. Luftwaffe commanders devoted enormous effort to bombing river crossings, yet the sheer volume of Soviet traffic made total interdiction impossible. Each night, even after the heaviest raids, boats still slipped through. This failure gnawed at German confidence. The idea of a decisive breakthrough faded as weeks passed without victory. Meanwhile, the weather began to shift. Cold winds swept across the steppe, signaling the approach of winter. Rain turned streets into mud, complicating movement and supply. Uniforms and equipment, never designed for prolonged urban warfare in harsh conditions, deteriorated rapidly. Frostbite joined bullets and shrapnel as a common cause of casualties. For the Soviets, winter offered both hardship and opportunity. They were better equipped for cold-weather fighting and accustomed to operating in brutal climates. More importantly, the season slowed German operations, reducing mobility and air support. While the fighting within the city remained savage, the broader strategic picture was beginning to change. Soviet High Command, carefully monitoring the situation, recognized that the German Sixth Army was becoming dangerously concentrated within Stalingrad. Its flanks held by weaker Allied forces stretched thin across the steppe. The longer the Germans remained bogged down in the city, the more vulnerable they became. Even as the defenders clung desperately to narrow strips of land along the Volga, sometimes no more than a few hundred meters wide, planning was underway far beyond the ruins. Reinforcements were being assembled, armor massed, and reserves prepared for a counteroffensive that would not strike at the city itself, but at the overstretched lines surrounding it. Within Stalingrad, however, none of this was yet visible. To the men fighting among the ruins, survival remained a moment-to-moment struggle. Night brought brief lulls punctuated by sudden violence. The soundscape of the city, artillery thunder, collapsing buildings, shouted orders, and the constant crack of gunfire, never truly ceased. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by explosions or alarms. Friendships formed quickly and ended just as fast, erased by death without ceremony. Civilians who remained in the city lived like ghosts, hiding in cellars, scavenging for scraps, and avoiding movement during daylight. Many had lost entire families. Their presence was a silent reminder of what was at stake, of a city that once lived and breathed now reduced to rubble and suffering. By late October, the Volga lifeline was stretched to its limit. Losses on the river were staggering, yet the flow continued. Each crossing represented an act of defiance against overwhelming odds. The defenders knew that as long as the Volga held, Stalingrad lived. And as long as Stalingrad lived, the German advance was stalled, bleeding itself dry against a city that refused to die. The river, dark and cold beneath the shellfire, became the dividing line between collapse and endurance, setting the stage for the dramatic reversal that was soon to come. Chapter 6, Segment 2. The Sniper's War, Fear in the Ruins. As Stalingrad was reduced to a shattered landscape of brick dust, twisted steel, and collapsed concrete, a new kind of warfare emerged from the ruins, silent, intimate, and psychologically devastating. This was the Sniper's War, fought not with sweeping offensives or roaring engines, but with patience, stillness, and a single bullet. The destruction of the city created an ideal environment for snipers. Broken walls became firing slits, rubble piles turned into natural camouflage, and half-standing buildings offered commanding views over streets, courtyards, and factory yards. In this environment, Soviet snipers flourished, transforming the ruins into a deadly maze where every shadow could conceal death. German soldiers soon learned that movement itself was dangerous. A careless step into the open, a helmet rising above a wall, or even the glint of sunlight on metal could invite an instant, lethal shot. Fear became constant, seeping into every moment of the day. Soldiers hesitated before crossing streets, crawled instead of walking, and froze at the sound of a rifle crack whose source could never be identified. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike artillery or machine gun fire, sniper attacks felt personal, deliberate, and unavoidable. Each kill carried the terrifying implication that someone was watching, waiting, and choosing the moment to strike. Among the most famous Soviet snipers was Vasily Zaitsev, whose exploits were widely publicized to boost morale. Zaitsev and others like him were trained not only to shoot accurately, but to think like hunters. They studied German routines, anticipated movements, and used deception, placing helmets on sticks, creating false firing positions, and relocating constantly to avoid detection. Snipers often worked in pairs or small teams, one shooter and one observer, coordinating silently through gestures and whispered signals. Their goal was not simply to kill, but to control space, deny movement, and spread fear far beyond the number of bullets fired. German attempts to counter this threat led to a deadly game of cat and mouse. Experienced marksmen were brought in to hunt Soviet snipers, resulting in duels that could last hours or even days. These confrontations were fought at extreme ranges or across narrow streets, with each side waiting for the slightest mistake. Survival depended on patience and discipline. A moment of impatience could mean death. Stories circulated among troops of legendary duels, though many were exaggerated or later mythologized. What mattered more than individual legends was the cumulative effect. Entire German units were slowed, pinned down, and psychologically exhausted by an enemy they could rarely see. The urban battlefield magnified this effect. Smoke, dust, and debris constantly shifted visibility. Shelling reshaped the terrain daily, creating new hiding places while destroying old ones. A building cleared in the morning might be lost again by afternoon. Snipers adapted quickly, exploiting fresh ruins and abandoned positions. They used sewers, crawl spaces, and shattered stairwells to move unseen. In some cases, they remained motionless for hours or even days, enduring cold, hunger, and discomfort to maintain concealment. The physical strain was severe, but the mental strain was even greater. Every sound had to be interpreted: a footstep, a voice, the scrape of equipment. Every decision carried life or death consequences. For German soldiers, the sniper threat altered daily life in the city. Simple tasks like carrying supplies, evacuating wounded, or delivering orders became perilous. Officers were particularly targeted, as their loss disrupted command and control. This forced changes in behavior. Ranks were removed from uniforms, commands were given quietly, and movement was restricted to darkness whenever possible. Despite these precautions, losses continued. The constant stress eroded morale. Letters home spoke of invisible enemies and the feeling of being hunted. Some soldiers developed acute anxiety, flinching at sudden noises or refusing to move without cover. The sniper war also had a symbolic dimension. Soviet propaganda elevated snipers as heroes, embodiments of resistance and skill triumphing over brute force. Training schools were established even during the battle, passing techniques from experienced marksmen to new recruits. Women also served as snipers, challenging traditional roles and further surprising German forces. Their presence added another layer to the psychological shock, undermining enemy assumptions and reinforcing the sense that the entire population was mobilized against them. For the civilians still trapped in Stalingrad, snipers were both protectors and additional sources of danger. While Soviet marksmen targeted German troops, civilians caught in crossfire risked being mistaken for enemy movement. Many learned to move only at certain times, hug walls, and freeze at unfamiliar sounds. The city became a place where silence was often safer than speech, and stillness was a survival skill. As winter approached, the sniper war intensified. Snow made footprints visible, forcing snipers to adopt new methods of concealment. Breath vapor had to be controlled to avoid revealing positions. Weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold, requiring constant maintenance. Despite these challenges, the effectiveness of snipers did not diminish. Instead, their role became even more critical as larger movements slowed and the battle settled into a grinding stalemate. Each shot fired was a reminder that control of Stalingrad was contested inch by inch, life by life. By November, the cumulative impact of the sniper war was undeniable. German units were exhausted, their advance stalled not only by physical resistance but by fear itself. The ruins of Stalingrad had become hostile territory where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. This environment eroded confidence and cohesion, contributing to the broader weakening of the Sixth Army. Unknown to many on the front lines, this attrition was buying time. Time for Soviet forces to prepare a massive counteroffensive beyond the city. In the shattered streets, snipers continued their deadly vigil, shaping the battle in quiet, lethal ways. Their war, fought in whispers and single shots, proved that even in the face of overwhelming firepower, control of terrain and psychology could be as decisive as tanks and artillery. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Operation Uranus, the trap begins to close. While the fighting inside Stalingrad consumed men, ammunition, and morale, a far greater drama was unfolding far beyond the ruined city. Unknown to most German soldiers locked in the rubble, the Soviet High Command was preparing one of the most ambitious and decisive counteroffensives of the entire war. This plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was not designed to retake every street of Stalingrad through brute force. Instead, It aimed to destroy the German Sixth Army altogether by striking where it was weakest, its exposed flanks. Since the summer advance of 1942, the German offensive had relied heavily on Allied forces to guard its northern and southern sides. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops, often poorly equipped, undertrained, and stretched thin across vast open terrain, were assigned to hold long defensive lines along the Don River and the southern steppe. German commanders were aware of these vulnerabilities but believed Soviet forces were too exhausted to exploit them. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Throughout September and October, as German attention remained fixed on the city itself, Soviet forces quietly amassed men, tanks, artillery, and supplies far from the front lines. Movements were concealed through strict radio silence, night marches, and elaborate deception operations. Entire armies were shifted into position under the cover of darkness and winter weather. The Red Army had learned from its earlier defeats and now planned not just a counterattack, but a complete operational encirclement. The goal was simple in concept but immense in execution. Smash through the weaker Axis flanks, drive armored spearheads deep into the rear of the Sixth Army, and seal the trap west of Stalingrad. By November 1942, the Soviets had assembled overwhelming force. Over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and massive artillery formations were positioned for the blow. Morale among Soviet troops was high, fueled by months of stubborn resistance inside the city and the growing belief that the tide of war was finally turning. On the German side, confidence still lingered, but it rested on false assumptions. Intelligence failures and underestimation of Soviet capabilities led German commanders to dismiss reports of large troop concentrations. The Sixth Army, deeply committed to the urban battle, had neither the reserves nor the mobility to respond quickly to a major breakthrough beyond the city limits. On the morning of November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began. At dawn, Soviet artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage against Romanian positions north of Stalingrad. The bombardment was overwhelming. Waves of shells tore through defensive lines, command posts, and supply depots. Romanian troops, lacking adequate anti-tank weapons and heavy artillery, were quickly overrun as Soviet armor surged forward through the shattered defenses. Entire sections of the front collapsed within hours. The following day, November 20th, a second massive assault struck south of Stalingrad, again targeting Axis forces guarding the German flank. The pattern repeated itself. Intense artillery fire, followed by infantry and tank assaults that broke through thin defensive lines. Soviet armored units advanced rapidly, exploiting the open terrain and bypassing pockets of resistance rather than becoming bogged down. Speed was essential. The objective was not territorial gain, but encirclement. As Soviet pincers drove westward from north and south, panic began to spread through German rear areas. Supply depots were captured, communication lines severed, and headquarters forced to relocate in chaos. German attempts to organize counterattacks were hampered by confusion, lack of fuel, and conflicting orders. Within days, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. On November 23rd, Soviet armored units from the northern and southern fronts met near the town of Kalakondan, closing the ring around Stalingrad. The trap had snapped shut. Over 250,000 Axis troops, primarily the German Sixth Army, along with elements of the 4th Panzer Army, were now encircled. Shock rippled through German command. For the first time in the war, an entire German field army was surrounded with little hope of escape. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Supplies that had been barely sufficient before were now entirely inadequate. Ammunition, fuel, and food dwindled at alarming rates. Medical services were overwhelmed, and wounded soldiers often lay untreated in freezing conditions. Despite the dire situation, Hitler forbade any attempt to break out. He insisted that the Sixth Army would hold its positions and be supplied by air until a relief force could reach it. This decision sealed the army's fate. The Luftwaffe lacked the aircraft, fuel, and capacity to supply such a massive force, especially in winter weather. Airfields were quickly lost or rendered unusable, and transport planes were shot down in increasing numbers. The promise of rescue became an illusion that prolonged suffering rather than alleviating it. Meanwhile, Soviet forces tightened the encirclement, repelling German breakout attempts and building up strength for the final destruction of the pocket. Inside Stalingrad, the nature of the battle changed. What had once been an offensive struggle became a fight for survival. German units were ordered to hold shrinking defensive perimeters, often without sufficient ammunition or food. Starvation and frostbite claimed as many lives as enemy fire. Discipline began to erode, though many soldiers continued to fight out of duty, fear, or sheer desperation. The psychological impact of encirclement was devastating. Hope faded as days passed without relief. Letters home spoke of cold, hunger, and resignation. For Soviet troops, Operation Uranus represented more than a military victory. It was proof that the Red Army could not only resist but decisively defeat the German war machine. The encirclement at Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war, both strategically and symbolically. Never again would German forces advance so deeply into Soviet territory. The initiative had shifted. As winter deepened and the ring around Stalingrad tightened, the fate of the Sixth Army was effectively sealed. Operation Uranus had succeeded beyond expectations, transforming Stalingrad from a desperate defensive battle into one of the greatest encirclements in military history. The city, once a symbol of German ambition, was now the grave of an entire army, and the beginning of the end for Nazi expansion in the East. Chapter 7, Segment 1, Encirclement, the city becomes a prison. By late November 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad had entered a new and irreversible phase. What had once been a brutal struggle for factories, streets, and riverbanks was now something far more desperate. A battle for survival inside a tightening ring of steel. Operation Uranus had succeeded with terrifying precision. The German Sixth Army, once confident in its strength and destiny, now found itself completely encircled, cut off from the rest of the Reich by hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Inside the pocket, the city of Stalingrad was no longer merely a battlefield. It had become a vast open-air prison. More than 250,000 Axis troops were trapped within its ruins, surrounded on all sides by Soviet armies that grew stronger with each passing day. The shock of encirclement spread slowly at first, then all at once. Many German soldiers initially refused to believe it. Rumors circulated that the situation was temporary, that armored relief forces were already advancing, that supplies would soon arrive. Officers repeated official assurances, clinging to orders that came down from above. Adolf Hitler himself had forbidden retreat, declaring that the Sixth Army would hold its ground and be resupplied by air until a counteroffensive could break through. The word encirclement was avoided in official communications, replaced by euphemisms like temporary isolation, but reality could not be disguised for long. The geography of the pocket became brutally clear. Soviet forces had closed the ring west of Stalingrad, near Kalach, severing the last land routes. German supply columns that attempted to break through were destroyed or captured. Radios crackled with desperate requests for ammunition, fuel, and food that could no longer be delivered by road. The only remaining lifeline was the air, and it was wholly insufficient. Hermann Göring had promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the Sixth Army from the sky, but this promise was based more on bravado than on logistical reality. The army required at least 600 tons of supplies per day to remain combat effective. On most days, the Luftwaffe managed less than a third of that, often far less. Winter storms, Soviet fighters, and anti-aircraft fire took a deadly toll on transport aircraft. Planes crashed on frozen fields or burned on improvised airstrips. Pilots flew until exhaustion, many never returning. Every crate of bread, every box of ammunition, became a matter of life and death. Inside the encirclement, shortages quickly became catastrophic. Fuel ran out first, immobilizing tanks and vehicles that were now little more than stationary bunkers. Ammunition followed. Artillery units rationed shells to a handful per day. Infantrymen counted bullets and reused enemy weapons when possible. Food supplies collapsed into starvation rations. Soldiers survived on thin soup made from frozen horse meat, bread mixed with sawdust, or whatever could be scavenged from abandoned ruins. Hunger gnawed constantly, weakening bodies and eroding morale. Medical care disintegrated under the strain. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded and frostbitten men. Without adequate supplies, surgeons operated without anesthetics, bandages were reused, and infections spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and trench foot became widespread. Many soldiers died not from enemy fire, but from exposure, disease, and untreated wounds. Corpses lay frozen where they fell, stacked in doorways or buried under rubble, unable to be moved. The psychological toll was just as severe. The certainty of isolation weighed heavily on every man. Days blurred together in a haze of cold, hunger, and fear. Letters from home grew rare, then stopped entirely. Radio broadcasts spoke of heroism and endurance, but they rang hollow against the reality of shrinking lines and mounting casualties. Some soldiers clung to discipline and routine as a way to survive mentally. Others sank into despair, their will to fight slowly extinguished. Desertion was nearly impossible. There was nowhere to go, but resignation spread quietly through the ranks. Command within the pocket became increasingly chaotic. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, faced impossible choices. Bound by Hitler's orders, he was forbidden to attempt a breakout without explicit permission. Yet every passing day reduced the army's chances of survival. Junior officers urged decisive action, while higher command in Berlin insisted that holding Stalingrad was essential for morale and prestige. The city, once a strategic objective, had become a symbol, and symbols, in Hitler's worldview, could not be abandoned. Meanwhile, Soviet forces consolidated their grip on the encirclement. They constructed layered defensive lines around the pocket, anticipating German relief attempts from the outside and desperate breakouts from within. Artillery was positioned to dominate escape routes. Tanks and infantry rotated in fresh units, while exhausted formations were pulled back to rest. Unlike the Germans, the Soviets now controlled the tempo of the battle. They could afford patience. Time, cold, and hunger were fighting on their side. For civilians still trapped in the ruins of Stalingrad, the encirclement brought no relief, only deeper suffering. Many had already been killed or displaced, but those who remained endured unimaginable conditions. With no shelter, no food distribution, and constant shelling, survival was a daily miracle. Some hid in cellars alongside soldiers from both sides, united only by the shared struggle to stay alive another night. As December approached, temperatures plunged far below freezing. Snow covered the battlefield, masking corpses and wreckage alike. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Soldiers slept huddled together for warmth, if they slept at all. The encircled army was slowly bleeding to death, one day at a time. Yet still, the order remained: hold Stalingrad. The city that had once been fought over inch by inch was now held by men who could barely stand. Encirclement had transformed the battle into something unprecedented. A prolonged siege fought under the harshest conditions imaginable. Stalingrad was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a test of endurance, obedience, and human limits. And as the walls of the Soviet ring tightened, it became increasingly clear that the Sixth Army's fate was not a matter of if, but when. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Frozen Inferno, Winter Inside the Cauldron. December 1942 descended upon the encircled German Sixth Army like an executioner's blade. The Soviet ring around Stalingrad held firm, and with it came the full force of the Russian winter, a merciless enemy that cared nothing for rank, ideology, or courage. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and below, turning the shattered city into a frozen graveyard. Snow buried corpses where they lay, hardening them into rigid shapes that soldiers used as cover from shellfire. The ruins no longer smelled of decay. The cold preserved everything, but the silence that followed each artillery barrage felt heavier than any stench. Inside the pocket, survival became a moment-to-moment struggle against hunger, cold, and hopelessness. The Luftwaffe's promised airlift collapsed under the weight of reality. Planes that did manage to land often brought far less than what was needed, and many carried evacuation orders for wounded officers rather than food for starving infantrymen. Airfields like Potomnik and Gumrak became scenes of desperation. Wounded men crawling toward aircraft, guards beating them back, pilots forced to choose who would live and who would remain behind. When these airfields fell under Soviet fire, even that fragile lifeline snapped. Supplies that once trickled and slowed to almost nothing. Soldiers' daily rations dropped to a few hundred calories, sometimes less. Men chewed frozen bread until their gums bled, boiled leather straps for soup, and scraped ice from the Volga, hoping to find something drinkable beneath it. Horses had long since been slaughtered. Dogs followed. Rats disappeared soon after. Hunger hollowed faces, dulled reflexes, and eroded discipline. Frostbite spread relentlessly. Toes blackened, fingers stiffened and snapped like dry wood. Many soldiers awoke to find limbs dead and useless, requiring amputation, if a surgeon was even available. Field hospitals were scenes of quiet horror. With no morphine, operations were performed using vodka or nothing at all. Screams echoed through basements until voices gave out. Medical staff collapsed from exhaustion, often dying beside the men they tried to save. Disease flourished in these conditions. Typhus swept through crowded shelters. Dysentery weakened those already barely standing. Lice infested uniforms that had not been removed for weeks or months. Sanitation was impossible. The dead could not be buried. The frozen ground resisted shovels, and the living lacked the strength. Bodies piled up in cellars and stairwells, becoming part of the landscape of ruin. Psychological collapse followed physical breakdown. Soldiers who had once believed in victory now spoke openly of death. Many lost the will to fight entirely, sitting motionless in the snow until they froze where they stood. Others became strangely calm, resigned to their fate. Discipline frayed. Officers struggled to maintain order among men who knew the end was approaching. Executions for desertion still occurred, but fear of punishment mattered less than the certainty of death by starvation or cold. Rumors circulated constantly, whispers of a breakout attempt, of relief forces advancing, of secret negotiations. Each rumor flared briefly, then died. The truth was undeniable. The Sixth Army had been abandoned. Outside the pocket, German relief efforts faltered. Operation Winterstorm, launched by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, advanced toward Stalingrad but stalled under fierce Soviet resistance. Paulus was ordered to hold his position and wait. A breakout was discussed, then dismissed. Hitler refused to authorize it, insisting that Stalingrad be held at all costs. Promotions replaced reinforcements. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal in January 1943, a clear signal that suicide or death was expected rather than surrender. Inside the cauldron, Soviet pressure increased steadily. Artillery pounded German positions day and night. Infantry assaults probed weakened lines. Tanks crushed through ruins that once provided shelter. The Red Army fought methodically, conserving strength, knowing time favored them. They did not need to rush. Hunger and cold were finishing the job. German units shrank to shadows of their former selves. Regiments became companies. Companies became handfuls of men. Command structures collapsed as officers were killed, wounded, or incapacitated. Radios fell silent as batteries froze or operators died. Orders became meaningless in a landscape where survival itself was uncertain. Civilians trapped within the ruins suffered alongside the soldiers. Those who had survived earlier phases of the battle now endured the same hunger and cold, scavenging among corpses for scraps. Some sought shelter with German units. Others hid in basements hoping to be overlooked by both sides. Death came quietly to many, without witnesses. By January 1943, the encirclement tightened further. Soviet forces split the pocket into smaller sections, isolating groups of defenders from one another. Organized resistance became impossible. The once proud Sixth Army was now a collection of starving, freezing men clinging to ruins that no longer held strategic value. Stalingrad had ceased to be a battle in any conventional sense. It was a slow extinction. The frozen inferno consumed everything: bodies, weapons, hope. And as the snow continued to fall, it became clear that the end was not just approaching. It had already arrived. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Desperation and Collapse, the last days of the Sixth Army. By late January 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad had entered its final, irreversible phase. What remained of the German Sixth Army was no longer a fighting force but a mass of exhausted, starving men scattered across shattered ruins, cellars, and snow-filled trenches. Soviet artillery now fired with near-total dominance, pounding German positions that no longer had the strength to respond. Ammunition was nearly gone. Many artillery batteries had fallen silent not because of enemy fire, but because there were no shells left to load. Rifles were shared between soldiers, machine guns lay frozen and unmanned, and tanks sat immobile, their fuel exhausted and engines seized by the cold. Command structures had collapsed almost entirely. Communication between units was sporadic or non-existent. Officers led whatever men remained by instinct rather than orders, and entire sections of the front simply vanished as soldiers froze, starved, or surrendered without resistance. Inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, Hitler still demanded obedience, still spoke of holding ground, still refused to accept defeat. Yet his words no longer reached the men dying in the ruins of Stalingrad. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, newly promoted in a final symbolic gesture from Hitler, understood the meaning clearly. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Die or destroy yourself. Paulus chose neither. In the final days, Soviet forces advanced relentlessly, splitting the encircled German pocket into smaller and smaller fragments. On January 26th, Soviet troops linked up near the Mamiev Kurgan, dividing the remaining German forces into a northern and southern group. Paulus commanded the southern pocket from the basement of the Univermag department store, surrounded by wounded men, corpses, and collapsing walls. Above ground, the Red Army moved block by block, room by room, encountering only sporadic resistance. Many German soldiers were too weak to lift their weapons. Some greeted Soviet troops with blank stares. Others wept openly. A few continued to fight until they were cut down, driven by pride, fear, or simple inertia. On January 31, 1943, Soviet officers entered Paulus's headquarters. The German field marshal, pale, exhausted, and hollow-eyed, surrendered the southern group of the Sixth Army. 2 days later, on February 2nd, the northern pocket followed. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers had entered the campaign. Fewer than 100,000 survived to surrender, and of those, only a fraction would ever return home. The frozen ruins were littered with bodies, German and Soviet alike, stacked in stairwells, buried under rubble, half visible beneath snowdrifts. The scale of destruction was almost impossible to comprehend. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Streets no longer had names, only memories of death. For the Red Army, victory came at a staggering cost. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had died defending and reclaiming the city. Civilians had been obliterated almost completely. Stalingrad itself was reduced to a skeleton of brick, steel, and ash. Yet the psychological impact of the victory was immense. For the first time, an entire German army had been annihilated and forced to surrender. The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered beyond repair. Across Europe, the shockwave spread. Allies took heart. Axis partners grew fearful. Within Germany, propaganda struggled to contain the truth. The loss of the Sixth Army could not be hidden forever. Families received vague notices of missing sons, husbands, and fathers. Mourning became widespread, though often silent. The war had turned decisively. Stalingrad marked the moment when the initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. From this point forward, the Red Army would advance westward, step by step, toward Berlin. The collapse at Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a moral and ideological reckoning. The war of annihilation launched by Nazi Germany had consumed its own soldiers with the same merciless logic it had inflicted on others. Hunger, cold, and rigid obedience had proven just as deadly as enemy fire. In the end, the Sixth Army did not fall in a dramatic final charge or heroic last stand. It disintegrated quietly, frozen into the ruins it had been ordered to hold at all costs. Stalingrad became a grave without headstones, a warning etched into history, and a turning point that reshaped the fate of the Second World War forever. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Victory at Stalingrad, a turning point in history. When the guns finally fell silent at Stalingrad in February 1943, the world stood at a historical crossroads. The surrender of the German Sixth Army marked far more than the end of a single battle. It represented a profound shift in the balance of power during the Second World War. For the first time, Nazi Germany had suffered the complete destruction of an entire field army, not through retreat or withdrawal, but through total encirclement, collapse, and surrender. News of the defeat spread rapidly, despite efforts by German propaganda to soften the blow. Within the Soviet Union, the victory was celebrated as nothing less than a miracle of endurance and sacrifice. For a nation that had suffered devastating losses since the launch of Operation Barbarossa, Stalingrad became a symbol of survival, resilience, and redemption. The city bearing Stalin's name had not fallen. Instead, it had consumed the invader. Soviet newspapers hailed the triumph as proof that the Red Army could not only stop the Wehrmacht, but destroy it. Across occupied Europe, whispers of hope spread quietly among resistance movements. If Germany could be defeated at Stalingrad, then the war was no longer unwinnable. In Allied capitals, military planners reassessed their strategies. The Soviet Union had demonstrated an ability to absorb unimaginable losses while delivering decisive blows. The Eastern Front was now unquestionably the main theater of the war, drawing the bulk of Germany's strength into a grinding struggle it could no longer sustain. For Germany, the psychological impact was devastating. The myth of invincibility that had carried the Wehrmacht from Poland to Paris and deep into the Soviet Union was irrevocably broken. Hitler's judgment, once seen as daring and inspired, now appeared reckless and detached from reality. His refusal to allow Paulus to retreat, his insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs, and his reliance on wishful thinking over logistics had condemned hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to death or captivity. The German public, long shielded from the full truth, slowly began to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. Entire communities realized that their men would never return. Mourning became widespread, even as the regime attempted to redirect blame and maintain morale. Militarily, Stalingrad marked the moment when the strategic initiative shifted decisively to the Soviet Union. From this point onward, the Red Army would dictate the tempo of operations on the Eastern Front. German forces would continue to fight fiercely, but increasingly on the defensive. The massive Soviet offensives that followed, from Kursk to the Dnieper, from Operation Bagration to the March on Berlin, all traced their momentum back to the victory at Stalingrad. The battle also reshaped the way war was understood. It demonstrated the brutal reality of modern, industrialized conflict. Entire cities reduced to rubble, armies destroyed by logistics as much as by bullets, and civilians trapped in battles that spared no one. Stalingrad revealed the limits of ideology when confronted with material reality. Fanaticism could not replace food, fuel, or ammunition. Orders could not overcome hunger, cold, and exhaustion. For the soldiers who survived, the legacy of Stalingrad was deeply personal. Soviet veterans carried the memory of fallen comrades, of nights spent clinging to ruins under relentless fire, of comrades frozen beside them in the snow. German survivors, few in number, carried trauma, guilt, and the weight of captivity. Most of the prisoners taken at Stalingrad would die in Soviet camps from disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Only years later would a small fraction return home, bearing witness to a defeat that shaped an entire generation. The city itself, once a symbol of industrial ambition, was left almost completely destroyed. Rebuilding Stalingrad would take years, but its ruins had already secured its place in history. It was here that the tide of the war turned. It was here that the vision of a swift German victory in the East died. And it was here that the long road toward the defeat of Nazi Germany truly began. Stalingrad became more than a battlefield. It became a warning and a lesson, a testament to the cost of total war and the resilience of those who endured it. Chapter 8, Segment 2. The Human Cost: Ruins, Graves, and Silent Survivors. In the aftermath of victory, Stalingrad revealed a landscape that defied comprehension. Where a city once stood along the Volga, there remained only shattered stone, twisted steel, and fields of rubble stretching as far as the eye could see. Streets had ceased to exist as recognizable pathways. They were now trenches filled with debris, frozen blood, and the remains of those who never left the battlefield. The human cost of the battle was written into every collapsed wall and burned-out factory. More than 2 million soldiers and civilians had been killed, wounded, captured, or displaced during the months of fighting, making Stalingrad the deadliest battle in human history. For the civilians who survived, victory brought no immediate relief. They emerged from cellars and ruins to a city without food, shelter, or functioning infrastructure. Families searched desperately for loved ones, often finding only mass graves or unmarked burial sites where the dead had been hastily covered during the fighting. Children wandered among the ruins, orphaned and malnourished, their memories shaped not by peace but by months of bombardment and fear. Soviet authorities moved quickly to document the devastation, not only for reconstruction but to preserve evidence of German crimes. Investigators recorded mass executions, starvation, and the deliberate targeting of civilians. Yet even as the scale of destruction became clear, the suffering continued. Disease spread rapidly among survivors weakened by hunger and exposure. Winters were still brutal and housing was scarce. Many lived for months in makeshift shelters carved out of rubble, sharing space with rats and the lingering stench of death. For the German prisoners of war, the end of the battle marked the beginning of another ordeal. Exhausted, frostbitten, and starving, tens of thousands were marched eastward into captivity. Few were prepared for the harsh conditions of Soviet prison camps. Lacking adequate medical care and nourishment, many died within weeks or months. Of the approximately 90,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, only a small fraction would ever return home. Their disappearance left a profound silence in Germany, as families waited for news that would never come. Among Soviet soldiers, survival carried its own burden. Victory did not erase the trauma of what they had endured. Veterans spoke of nightmares filled with artillery fire, collapsing buildings, and the faces of fallen comrades. Many returned home permanently scarred, physically and psychologically. The Soviet state celebrated them as heroes, but private grief remained unspoken. In official narratives, individual suffering was often overshadowed by collective triumph. Yet beneath the banners and parades lay a nation mourning its dead. Entire divisions had been wiped out. Entire neighborhoods of Stalingrad had vanished. The city itself became a vast cemetery. Reconstruction began almost immediately, driven by political necessity and symbolic importance. Stalin ordered Stalingrad rebuilt as a testament to Soviet resilience. Factories rose again, housing blocks replaced ruins, and monuments were planned to honor the defenders of the city. But beneath the new foundations lay countless bodies. Even decades later, construction crews would uncover bones, helmets, and rusted weapons, silent reminders of the battle fought beneath their feet. The Volga River, once a lifeline of supply and evacuation, also bore the scars of war. Its banks were littered with wrecked boats and debris. Fishermen later reported pulling fragments of uniforms and equipment from the water, long after the fighting ended. Nature itself seemed to remember what had happened there. The human cost of Stalingrad extended far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped families, communities, and national identities. In the Soviet Union, the battle became a cornerstone of wartime memory, a story passed down through generations as proof of endurance against overwhelming odds. In Germany, it became a symbol of loss and miscalculation, a turning point that marked the beginning of the end. For historians, Stalingrad stands as a stark example of the consequences of total war, where civilians and soldiers alike are consumed by conflict, and victory is inseparable from tragedy. The ruins of Stalingrad taught the world that even decisive triumph comes at a price measured not only in territory gained or armies destroyed, but in human lives forever altered. Long after the guns fell silent, the echoes of suffering continued to shape memory, reminding future generations that the cost of war is paid long after the last battle is won. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Memory, Myth, and the Burden of Victory. As the smoke cleared over Stalingrad and the ruins slowly settled into silence, the battle began a second life, not on the battlefield, but in memory. Almost immediately, Stalingrad was transformed from a devastated city into a powerful symbol. For the Soviet Union, it became more than a military victory. It was elevated into a myth of national survival, sacrifice, and destiny. The narrative that emerged emphasized heroism, endurance, and unity, portraying the battle as the moment when the Soviet people, standing on the brink of annihilation, seized history and forced it to turn. Official histories spoke of unbreakable will, of workers and soldiers fighting as one, of a city that refused to fall because surrender was unthinkable. This story served an important purpose. After years of catastrophic losses, it gave meaning to suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. Stalingrad was framed as proof that sacrifice had not been in vain. Yet this myth, while powerful, often simplified a far more complex reality. Beneath the polished language of victory lay chaos, fear, coercion, and staggering human cost. Soviet soldiers fought with courage, but many were also driven by desperation, discipline enforced by harsh penalties, and the knowledge that retreat was often a death sentence. Civilians endured not only German bombardment, but hunger, cold, and displacement under conditions few could survive. These realities were rarely emphasized in public commemoration. Memory became selective, shaped by political needs as much as historical truth. Monuments rose across the rebuilt city, most famously the immense statue of the Motherland Calls, dominating the skyline and embodying the idea of sacrifice made sacred. Annual commemorations reinforced Stalingrad's place as the moral turning point of the war. School children learned its story as a lesson in patriotism. Veterans were honored as living symbols of endurance, even as many struggled silently with trauma. In Germany, memory took a very different form. Stalingrad was remembered as a catastrophe, a wound that never fully healed. Unlike other defeats, it could not be reframed as a strategic withdrawal or temporary setback. The destruction of the Sixth Army shattered the myth of German invincibility that Nazi propaganda had carefully constructed. Families waited for sons, husbands, and fathers who would never return. For years, Stalingrad was spoken of in hushed tones, associated with loss, betrayal by leadership, and the bitter realization that the war could not be won. After 1945, West Germany largely avoided public commemoration of Stalingrad, focusing instead on rebuilding and distancing itself from the Nazi past. In East Germany, the battle was remembered through a Soviet lens, emphasizing anti-fascist struggle while downplaying German responsibility. Across Europe and beyond, Stalingrad entered global consciousness as a warning. Military academies studied it as a case study in urban warfare, logistics, and the dangers of overextension. Historians debated its meaning. Was it the true turning point of the war, or one of several critical moments? What remained undisputed was its scale. No other battle combined such intense urban combat, such prolonged suffering, and such massive loss of life. The burden of victory weighed heavily on the survivors. Many Soviet veterans found that peace did not bring closure. Their experiences were celebrated publicly, but privately they carried memories of frozen nights, relentless shelling, and the faces of friends buried under rubble. Psychological wounds went largely untreated, masked by the expectation of stoicism. Civilians, too, bore scars that reconstruction could not erase. Entire generations grew up surrounded by stories of the battle, living atop ground that concealed the dead. Even decades later, unexploded ordnance and human remains continued to surface, reminders that the past was never fully buried. Stalingrad's legacy also shaped how the war itself was remembered. It reinforced the idea that total war demands total sacrifice, a belief that could be both unifying and dangerous. By glorifying endurance above all else, it risked normalizing suffering as inevitable, even necessary. Yet for many, remembering Stalingrad was not about glorification, but about warning. The ruins stood as evidence of what happens when ideology, ambition, and dehumanization collide. In this sense, Stalingrad became a moral lesson as much as a historical event. Today, known as Volgograd, the city continues to live under the shadow of its past. Museums, memorials, and preserved ruins invite visitors to confront the history embedded in its streets. The battle is no longer only a Soviet story or a German tragedy. It is a human one. Stalingrad reminds the world that victory achieved through immense destruction leaves a legacy that endures long after the war ends. Memory, shaped by myth and truth alike, ensures that the battle is not forgotten. And in that remembrance lies both honor for the dead and a solemn responsibility for the living. To understand the cost of war, and to recognize that even the greatest victories are inseparable from profound loss. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The encirclement begins, Operation Uranus Unleashed. By November 1942, the battlefield around Stalingrad had reached a deadly stalemate, one that masked a profound shift beneath the surface. While the German Sixth Army remained locked in brutal street fighting inside the city, the Red Army was quietly preparing an operation that would change the course of the war. This plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, was not aimed at the heavily fortified German troops within Stalingrad itself, but at the weaker forces guarding their flanks. For months, Soviet commanders had studied the enemy's disposition and recognized a critical vulnerability. The northern and southern flanks of the German advance were held not by elite German divisions, but by overstretched Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, poorly equipped for winter warfare and lacking sufficient anti-tank weapons. These Allied formations were expected to hold vast stretches of open steppe with limited resources, a task that left them exposed to a concentrated assault. On the frozen morning of November 19, 1942, the illusion of German control shattered. Under a gray sky heavy with snow, Soviet artillery erupted across the steppe north of Stalingrad, unleashing a thunderous barrage that rolled across the plains like a storm. Thousands of guns fired simultaneously, their shells tearing into Romanian positions, obliterating trenches, command posts, and communication lines. Within hours, Soviet infantry and tank formations surged forward, exploiting gaps that widened with terrifying speed. Entire Romanian units collapsed under the weight of the assault, some fighting desperately, others fleeing in chaos as Soviet armor punched through their lines. The following day, November 20th, the southern pincer struck. Once again, the Red Army targeted the weakest points, overwhelming Axis defenses south of Stalingrad with massed armor, artillery, and infantry advancing in coordinated waves. The German command, fixated on the ongoing struggle inside the city, was slow to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Reports of breakthroughs were initially dismissed or underestimated, seen as localized setbacks rather than the opening of a strategic catastrophe. Yet as Soviet spearheads drove deeper into the rear areas, capturing supply depots, airfields, and key road junctions, the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. Within days, the two Soviet pincers raced toward one another across the steppe, advancing with relentless momentum despite harsh weather and fierce resistance. On November 23, 1942, near the town of Kalach on the Don River, Soviet forces linked up, sealing the encirclement. The trap had closed. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops, German, Romanian, and other Allied soldiers, were now surrounded in what would soon be known as the Stalingrad Kessel, the cauldron. For the men inside the pocket, the realization was devastating. Supply routes vanished overnight. Ammunition, fuel, and food that had once flowed into the city were abruptly cut off. Paulus and his staff confronted a grim reality. The Sixth Army was encircled hundreds of kilometers inside enemy territory, facing a Soviet force growing stronger by the day. Yet even at this moment, the possibility of breakout was still debated. Some German commanders urged immediate action, arguing that a swift, coordinated attempt to break through the encirclement offered the only chance of survival. But Adolf Hitler, convinced that Stalingrad must be held at all costs, forbade any retreat. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, a pledge rooted more in wishful thinking than logistical reality. Hermann Göring assured Hitler that German air power could sustain the Sixth Army, despite clear evidence that the required tonnage far exceeded the Luftwaffe's capabilities, especially in winter conditions and under constant Soviet attack. As days turned into weeks, the encirclement tightened. Soviet forces constructed multiple defensive rings around the pocket, preparing not only to contain the trapped army, but to crush any relief attempt. Inside the cauldron, the psychological impact of encirclement began to erode morale. Soldiers who had endured months of close-quarters combat now faced a slow, grinding descent into hunger, cold, and despair. Rations were slashed repeatedly as air deliveries fell far short of needs. Wounded men lay untreated in freezing shelters. Horses were slaughtered for meat, then dogs, and eventually anything edible that could be found. The encirclement marked a decisive shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. For the first time, an entire German field army faced annihilation not through retreat, but through total destruction. Operation Uranus demonstrated that the Red Army had evolved into a force capable of planning and executing large-scale, sophisticated operations, combining deception, intelligence, and overwhelming firepower. It shattered the myth of German operational invincibility and sent shockwaves through Axis capitals. As winter deepened and snow covered the steppe, the encirclement of Stalingrad became not just a military maneuver, but a sentence. The city that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives now stood as the center of a vast, frozen trap. What followed would be a slow, merciless collapse, one measured not in days, but in lives, as the trapped army struggled against starvation, frost, and the inexorable advance of Soviet forces determined to ensure that Stalingrad would never again be threatened. Chapter 9, Segment 2. The Trapped Titans, Life and Death Inside the Stalingrad Cauldron. After the encirclement was sealed in late November 1942, the reality inside the Stalingrad pocket changed with terrifying speed. What had once been a brutal but active battlefield turned into a prison of snow, smoke, and hunger. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers, primarily the German Sixth Army, found themselves cut off from the outside world, surrounded by an enemy that now held overwhelming numerical and material superiority. At first, many soldiers clung to the belief that the encirclement was temporary. Rumors spread through the ranks that a relief force was already on its way, that the Luftwaffe would keep them supplied, and that Stalingrad would be held until spring if necessary. These hopes, however, were built on illusions that soon collapsed under the weight of reality. The promised airlift never came close to meeting the Army's needs. To sustain the trapped forces, the Sixth Army required at least 600 tons of supplies per day: food, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, and winter clothing. In practice, the Luftwaffe rarely delivered more than a fraction of that amount. Poor weather, Soviet anti-aircraft fire, fighter attacks, and the sheer distance from German airfields meant that transport planes were lost at an alarming rate. Many aircraft never reached the pocket at all, while others crash-landed on improvised airstrips, becoming twisted wrecks half buried in snow. Each failed delivery deepened the crisis inside the cauldron. Food shortages became severe within weeks. Soldiers received starvation rations that dwindled day by day, thin soup made from horse meat, frozen bread so hard it had to be broken with rifle butts, and eventually almost nothing at all. Malnutrition weakened already exhausted men, leaving them vulnerable to disease and frostbite. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, often reaching -30 degrees Celsius. Without adequate winter clothing, soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, newspapers, or scraps of blankets, huddling together in cellars and dugouts for warmth. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs, while those who collapsed from exhaustion sometimes froze to death where they fell. Medical conditions inside the pocket were catastrophic. Field hospitals overflowed with wounded men, many suffering from untreated infections, gangrene, or shrapnel wounds that would have been survivable under normal conditions. Supplies of bandages, anesthetics, and medicines ran out quickly. Surgeons were forced to operate without proper tools, sometimes using knives heated over candles, amputating limbs to save lives that could not truly be saved. As the wounded piled up, many were simply left to die, wrapped in blankets and placed in corners of cellars, their moans echoing through the ruins. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, and trench foot became rampant, further reducing the fighting strength of the army. Meanwhile, Soviet pressure never ceased. Artillery fire pounded the pocket day and night, shells crashing into ruined buildings, supply dumps, and airstrips. Soviet infantry probed German defenses constantly, launching local attacks designed to shrink the encirclement and exhaust the defenders. Every meter of ground lost tightened the noose further. German units were forced into increasingly cramped positions, defending shrinking perimeters amid rubble, snowdrifts, and frozen corpses. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers who had once believed in victory now confronted the certainty of abandonment. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, spoke of a Germany far away, untouched by the misery of the front. Many men stopped writing altogether, convinced that no one would ever read their words. Discipline began to erode as despair spread. Some soldiers refused orders. Others wandered aimlessly through the ruins in search of food or warmth. Suicide became increasingly common, as men chose death on their own terms rather than slow starvation or capture. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion, issuing orders that rang hollow in the face of overwhelming odds. At the highest levels of command, the situation grew increasingly detached from reality. General Friedrich Paulus, bound by his oath and by Hitler's explicit orders, refused to authorize a breakout attempt without permission. Each day he sent reports to headquarters describing the worsening conditions, pleading for either massive reinforcement or authorization to withdraw. Each day, Hitler responded with demands to hold fast, insisting that Stalingrad must not fall and that relief was imminent. The planned German rescue operation, codenamed Operation Winterstorm, launched in December 1942, advanced to within roughly 50 kilometers of the pocket before being halted by determined Soviet resistance. The trapped soldiers could hear distant artillery, fueling hope that help was close, but no breakout order ever came. When the relief attempt failed, the final hope of escape vanished. Inside the cauldron, time lost meaning. Days blended into nights, marked only by bombardments, roll calls of the dead, and the relentless struggle to survive another hour. The once proud Sixth Army was disintegrating into a mass of starving, freezing men clinging to life amid ruins that offered no shelter and no mercy. Stalingrad had transformed from a battlefield into a graveyard in waiting. As December gave way to January, it became clear that the encirclement was not a temporary setback but a death sentence. The Red Army, patient and methodical, prepared for the final phase, one that would crush the pocket entirely. The men inside the cauldron sensed what was coming. They fought on not for victory, but for survival, for comrades beside them, and for the faint hope that somehow, against all reason, the nightmare might end before it consumed them completely. Chapter 9, Segment 3. The End of the Sixth Army, Surrender, Silence, and the Weight of Defeat. By January 1943, the fate of the German Sixth Army was no longer a matter of speculation but of inevitability. The Soviet High Command, having tightened the encirclement and exhausted the defenders through relentless pressure, prepared to deliver the final blow. Operation Ring, the code name for the destruction of the Stalingrad pocket, began on January 10th with a thunderous artillery barrage unlike anything the trapped soldiers had yet endured. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, shaking the frozen earth and turning the ruins into a landscape of fire and steel. For hours, shells rained down on German positions, pulverizing defensive lines, collapsing dugouts, and burying men alive beneath rubble and ice. When the Soviet infantry advanced, they did so against an enemy that was no longer capable of coordinated resistance. The Sixth Army, once a formidable fighting force, had been reduced to a shattered remnant. Units were fragmented, communications broken, and command structures barely functioning. German soldiers fought back where they could, but their ammunition was nearly gone, their bodies weakened by hunger and cold, and their morale crushed by months of isolation and abandonment. One position after another fell as Soviet forces advanced methodically, splitting the pocket into smaller and smaller sections. By mid-January, the German-held territory had been divided into two isolated groups, a northern pocket around the tractor factory and a southern pocket centered on the city center and the ruins near the Volga. Even as the situation became hopeless, Adolf Hitler continued to issue orders forbidding surrender. On January 30th, 1943, in a final gesture of delusion and symbolism, Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, and Paulus was expected to die rather than lay down his arms. Yet this gesture changed nothing on the ground. Paulus, exhausted, ill, and increasingly detached from the Führer's fantasies, knew that further resistance would only result in meaningless death. The northern pocket collapsed first. Surrounded, outgunned, and without supplies, the remnants of German units there ceased organized resistance on January 31st. Thousands of soldiers staggered out of cellars and ruins, raising makeshift white flags or simply dropping their weapons in the snow. The southern pocket followed shortly after. On February 2, 1943, the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad ended. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the approximately 300,000 Axis soldiers originally encircled, only about 90,000 survived to be taken prisoner. Among them were 22 generals and countless officers and enlisted men who had once believed themselves part of an invincible army. The scene after the surrender was haunting. Soviet soldiers moved cautiously through the ruins, encountering columns of emaciated prisoners. Men reduced to skeletal figures, wrapped in rags, many barely able to walk. The streets were littered with frozen corpses, abandoned weapons, and shattered equipment, silent witnesses to the scale of destruction. For the prisoners, the ordeal was far from over. The Soviet Union, itself devastated by years of war, was ill-prepared to care for such vast numbers of captives. Long marches through snow and rubble claimed thousands of lives within days of the surrender. Disease, malnutrition, and exposure continued to take their toll in transit camps and improvised holding areas. Of the 90,000 prisoners captured at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Many years later, their lives forever marked by what they had endured. The psychological impact of Stalingrad reverberated far beyond the battlefield. In Germany, the news of the surrender shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Although the regime attempted to control the narrative, declaring the fallen heroes of Stalingrad martyrs for the Reich, the truth could not be fully concealed. Families received no letters, no explanations, only silence or official notices of death. The loss of an entire army was unprecedented, and it shook confidence in Hitler's leadership at every level of society. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and ultimate victory against overwhelming odds. The city itself lay in ruins, its population decimated, its buildings reduced to rubble, but its name would forever be associated with the turning of the tide. Militarily, Stalingrad marked the moment when the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed decisively to the Red Army. From this point onward, German forces would increasingly find themselves on the defensive, retreating westward under relentless Soviet pressure. Yet, beyond strategy and symbolism lay the human cost. Stalingrad consumed more than 2 million soldiers and civilians, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Entire generations were scarred by the battle, and its legacy would shape memory, propaganda, and identity for decades. The surrender did not bring relief or closure to those who survived. Instead, it left a void filled with grief, guilt, and unanswered questions. For many German soldiers, captivity became a long, slow reckoning with the decisions that had led them there. For Soviet soldiers and civilians, victory was inseparable from unimaginable loss. As the guns finally fell silent along the Volga, the ruins of Stalingrad stood as a grim monument to modern industrial warfare, a place where ideology, ambition, and human suffering collided with devastating force. The battle was over, but its echoes would endure long after the last prisoner was marched away, shaping the course of the war and the memory of the 20th century itself. Chapter 10, Segment 1: Victory, Meaning, and the Turning of the World. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad did not merely conclude a battle. It marked a profound transformation in the course of the Second World War and in the psychological landscape of the 20th century. For the first time since the launch of Operation Barbarossa, an entire German field army had been annihilated, not through retreat or tactical withdrawal, but through encirclement, starvation, and total collapse. The implications of this defeat rippled outward from the ruins along the Volga to every front of the war. In Moscow, the victory was celebrated not only as a military triumph but as a moral vindication. After months, indeed years, of retreat, devastation, and loss, the Red Army had demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be stopped, surrounded, and destroyed. Soviet propaganda quickly elevated Stalingrad into a symbol of national resilience and collective sacrifice, framing the battle as proof that the Soviet people, through endurance and unity, had broken the backbone of Hitler's war machine. Yet beneath the celebratory banners and triumphant speeches lay a sobering reality. The city was destroyed beyond recognition, and the cost of victory had been almost unfathomable. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist, factories lay in twisted ruins, and tens of thousands of civilians who had endured bombardment, hunger, and cold now faced a long struggle simply to survive in the aftermath. Still, Stalingrad became a rallying cry, a turning point that infused the Soviet war effort with renewed confidence and determination. Militarily, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The Red Army seized the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front, launching a series of offensives that would steadily push German forces westward. The myth of German operational superiority, of lightning victories and unstoppable panzer spearheads, was shattered. German commanders, already strained by Hitler's increasingly rigid control and refusal to permit tactical retreats, now faced an enemy that had learned from its early defeats and adapted with devastating effectiveness. The loss of experienced troops, officers, and equipment at Stalingrad weakened the Wehrmacht irreparably, creating gaps that could never fully be replaced. For Germany, Stalingrad marked the beginning of a long, grinding retreat that would end only in the ruins of Berlin more than 2 years later. On the home front, the impact was equally profound. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, struggled to contain the psychological damage caused by the defeat. In February 1943, he delivered his infamous total war speech in Berlin, appealing to the German people to accept greater sacrifices in the face of mounting adversity. This appeal itself was an admission of crisis. The war that had once been sold as swift and victorious now demanded everything: labor, resources, lives, and offered only uncertainty in return. For many Germans, Stalingrad planted the first seeds of doubt that the regime's promises could not fulfill. Letters from the front ceased. Families waited in vain for news of sons and husbands who would never return. The silence surrounding the fate of the Sixth Army became a collective wound, one that the regime could neither fully explain nor erase. Beyond Germany and the Soviet Union, Stalingrad reshaped global perceptions of the war. In Allied capitals, the battle was hailed as a decisive turning point. Britain and the United States recognized that the Eastern Front had become the primary arena of Germany's destruction, absorbing the vast majority of German forces and resources. The victory strengthened Allied resolve and reinforced the necessity of opening a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Stalingrad thus played a crucial role not only in military strategy but in diplomatic relations among the Allies, shaping planning that would eventually lead to the Normandy landings in 1944. Yet even as Stalingrad altered the trajectory of the war, its meaning extended beyond strategy and politics. It forced a confrontation with the nature of modern warfare itself. The battle had consumed human lives on an industrial scale, turning entire armies into expendable components of ideological conflict. Soldiers on both sides were subjected to conditions that defied endurance. Constant bombardment, extreme cold, starvation, and the psychological terror of urban combat where death could come from any direction. The ruins of the city became a grim laboratory of total war, demonstrating how civilian spaces could be transformed into killing fields and how survival often depended on chance as much as courage or skill. For the survivors, memory became a burden carried for a lifetime. Soviet veterans remembered Stalingrad as a place of both pride and trauma, where comrades fell in unimaginable numbers and victory was purchased at the edge of human endurance. German survivors, few as they were, carried the stigma of defeat and the haunting memory of surrender, captivity, and loss. The battle became a defining reference point in post-war narratives, shaping how both nations understood their past and justified their sacrifices. In the years that followed, Stalingrad would be commemorated, mythologized, and studied, its lessons debated by historians and military theorists alike. It stood as a warning of what happens when ideology overrides humanity, when leaders refuse reality, and when entire populations are mobilized for destruction. As the world moved forward from the ashes of the Second World War, the name Stalingrad endured, not simply as a place on a map, but as a symbol of the moment when the tide turned, when the course of history shifted, and when the cost of war was laid bare in frozen streets and shattered lives. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Ruins, Reconstruction, and the Weight of Memory. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad, silence settled over a city that had once roared with gunfire, engines, and human voices. What remained along the banks of the Volga was not a functioning city, but a vast field of ruins stretching for miles. Collapsed factories, pulverized apartment blocks, shattered rail yards, and streets so choked with debris that their original paths were barely recognizable. The physical destruction was almost total. Estimates suggest that over 90% of Stalingrad's buildings had been damaged or destroyed, leaving hundreds of thousands without shelter in the depths of winter. Survivors emerged from cellars, basements, and makeshift dugouts to face a landscape that seemed almost lunar in its devastation. The air carried the lingering smell of smoke, decay, and cordite, while unexploded ordnance lay hidden beneath rubble, a constant reminder that the battle's dangers had not yet ended. Civilians who had endured months of siege now confronted a different struggle: how to rebuild lives in a city that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Food was scarce, clean water limited, and disease a looming threat. Yet even amid this devastation, the Soviet state moved quickly to assert control and purpose. Reconstruction was framed not merely as a practical necessity, but as a moral imperative, a testament to the triumph of endurance over annihilation. Workers, engineers, and soldiers were mobilized to clear debris, restore basic infrastructure, and revive industry. Factories that had once produced tractors and steel were rebuilt to serve both civilian needs and ongoing wartime production, symbolizing the fusion of survival and resistance that defined the Soviet war effort. Stalingrad was to rise again, not as a memorial of defeat, but as a monument to victory. At the same time, the human cost of the battle became increasingly apparent. Hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers suffering from frostbite, amputations, and psychological trauma that would later be recognized as combat stress. Families searched desperately for missing relatives, often finding only fragments of information or nothing at all. For many, closure never came. The dead lay buried in mass graves, hastily marked or entirely anonymous, their individual stories subsumed into the enormity of the collective sacrifice. German prisoners of war, tens of thousands of them, were marched eastward into captivity, beginning years of forced labor and imprisonment from which many would never return. Their suffering, while distinct in context, added another layer to the tragedy of Stalingrad, illustrating how the battle consumed all who were drawn into its orbit, regardless of uniform or allegiance. As the war continued and eventually ended in 1945, Stalingrad's legacy began to take shape in the realm of memory and meaning. In the Soviet Union, the battle was elevated to near-mythic status, woven into a narrative of heroic resistance and inevitable triumph. Monuments were erected, medals awarded, and stories of individual bravery carefully curated to inspire future generations. The city itself was renamed Volgograd in 1961, yet the name Stalingrad remained etched in global consciousness, inseparable from the events that unfolded there. This dual identity reflected the tension between remembrance and reinvention, between honoring the past and shaping a future unburdened by its darkest moments. For Germany, Stalingrad became a symbol of catastrophe and loss, a stark reminder of the consequences of overreach, ideological fanaticism, and blind obedience. In the post-war years, as Germany confronted the legacy of the Nazi regime, Stalingrad stood as a focal point for reflection on military hubris and moral responsibility. Veterans' accounts, memoirs, and historical analyses grappled with questions of guilt, victimhood, and accountability, often revealing the psychological scars left by the battle long after the guns fell silent. Internationally, Stalingrad reshaped how the world understood modern warfare. Military academies studied its tactics, logistics, and command failures, while historians debated its strategic inevitability and moral implications. The battle demonstrated that wars of annihilation consume not only armies but entire societies, erasing boundaries between front lines and home fronts, soldiers and civilians. It underscored the dangers of total war, where ideological goals justify limitless violence and human life becomes expendable. In this sense, Stalingrad served as both a warning and a lesson, a case study in how easily humanity can descend into destruction when political ambition and hatred override empathy and restraint. As decades passed, survivors' voices became increasingly important in preserving the truth of what occurred. Oral histories, diaries, and testimonies captured the lived experience behind statistics and strategic maps, revealing moments of compassion amid brutality. Soldiers sharing bread in ruined cellars, nurses working without rest, civilians risking their lives to ferry supplies across the Volga under fire. These stories complicated the grand narratives of victory and defeat, reminding later generations that history is composed not only of turning points and outcomes, but of individual lives caught within them. Today, the memory of Stalingrad endures as a solemn reminder of both resilience and ruin. It stands as a testament to the capacity of human beings to endure unimaginable suffering, but also as evidence of the catastrophic consequences of war pursued without limits. The ruins have been rebuilt, the city transformed, yet beneath modern streets lies the shadow of the past, a silent echo of millions who lived, fought, and died there. In remembering Stalingrad, the world confronts not only a decisive moment in World War II, but a broader truth about the fragility of civilization and the enduring cost of conflict when humanity itself becomes the battlefield. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Stalingrad Remembered, Lessons Written in Blood. As the decades passed and the ruins of Stalingrad slowly disappeared beneath concrete, steel, and modern life, the battle itself refused to fade into history. Instead, it hardened into memory, both sacred and painful, shaped by those who survived and by generations who inherited its meaning. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became more than a military victory. It became a moral cornerstone of national identity. School children learned its story as a symbol of unity and sacrifice. Artists and writers returned to it as a source of solemn inspiration, and veterans carried its scars in silence, often unable or unwilling to fully describe what they had witnessed. The immense statue the motherland calls rising above Mamiev Kurgan came to embody this memory. Her sword raised not in triumph, but in warning, a reminder that victory had been purchased with unimaginable human cost. Beneath her feet lay thousands of soldiers buried where they fell, the earth itself transformed into a memorial. Yet memory is never singular. Outside the Soviet narrative, historians and observers sought to understand Stalingrad not only as a triumph, but as a tragedy on a scale rarely seen before or since. The battle challenged traditional ideas of heroism and strategy, forcing a reckoning with the realities of industrialized warfare. It revealed how modern conflict blurred the line between combatant and civilian, turning entire cities into killing fields and entire populations into targets. Civilians were not merely caught in the crossfire. They were consumed by it, starved, buried alive, frozen, bombed, and displaced in numbers that defied comprehension. In Stalingrad, survival itself became an act of resistance, and endurance replaced glory as the defining measure of courage. For Germany, the legacy of Stalingrad unfolded more slowly and more painfully. In the immediate post-war years, many veterans struggled with trauma and shame, haunted by memories of comrades left to die in snow-filled ruins, and by the knowledge that the campaign had been fueled by ideological aggression rather than necessity. As Germany confronted its Nazi past, Stalingrad emerged as a symbol of reckoning, a moment when the illusion of invincibility shattered, exposing the human cost of blind loyalty and total war. The battle forced German society to confront uncomfortable truths, that obedience could become complicity, and that silence could be as destructive as violence. This process of reflection, though uneven and contested, became part of a broader effort to understand how a modern, educated society could be drawn into catastrophic moral collapse. Globally, Stalingrad reshaped how wars were remembered and taught. It entered textbooks not simply as a turning point, but as a warning. Military strategists examined it to understand the limits of logistics, the dangers of overextension, and the role of morale in prolonged conflict. Human rights advocates pointed to it as evidence of the catastrophic consequences of dehumanization, where ideological enemies were reduced to obstacles to be destroyed. In this way, Stalingrad transcended its immediate historical context, becoming a universal case study in the extremes of human behavior under pressure, both the capacity for cruelty and the capacity for resilience. The passage of time brought new challenges to memory. As eyewitnesses aged and died, the responsibility for remembrance shifted to archives, museums, and educators. Survivors' testimonies, once dismissed or simplified by official narratives, gained renewed importance, offering nuanced perspectives that resisted glorification. These voices spoke of fear, hunger, moral ambiguity, and moments of unexpected humanity. Stories that complicated simple narratives of good and evil without diminishing the reality of suffering. Preserving these testimonies became an act of resistance against forgetting, distortion, or denial. In an era when historical memory is increasingly contested, Stalingrad stands as a bulwark against the erosion of truth. It reminds the world that the consequences of war extend far beyond battlefield victories and defeats, shaping societies for generations. The rebuilt city of Volgograd, with its modern infrastructure and daily rhythms, exists alongside this shadowed past. Life continues, children are born, and the river Volga flows as it always has. But beneath the surface lies a history that cannot be erased, only acknowledged. Ultimately, the legacy of Stalingrad lies not solely in its outcome, but in its enduring message. It teaches that wars fought in the name of ideology can devour everything in their path, including the values they claim to defend. It shows that human endurance, while extraordinary, should never be tested to such extremes. And it underscores a responsibility shared by all who remember it, to recognize the warning embedded in its ruins and stories, and to ensure that future generations understand not only what happened, but why it must never be allowed to happen again. In this way, Stalingrad remains alive, not as a battlefield, but as a lesson written in blood, memory, and the fragile hope that remembrance can shape a more humane future. When silence speaks loudest as this journey through the Battle of Stalingrad comes to an end, what remains is not only the echo of artillery or the images of ruined streets, but a profound silence, the kind that follows unimaginable loss. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a collision of ideology, ambition, fear, and human endurance, played out in frozen rubble along the banks of the Volga. Millions entered its story. Far fewer survived to tell it in those shattered buildings and snow-covered trenches. History reached one of its darkest turning points. The city became a graveyard, a fortress, and a symbol all at once. A place where the limits of human suffering were tested, and where the course of the war and the world changed forever. Victory came, but it came drenched in sorrow, leaving scars that would outlive the generation that fought there. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let Stalingrad be remembered not for numbers or strategy alone, but for the lives behind them, the soldiers who froze in silence, the civilians who endured hunger and terror, and the city that refused to vanish even as it burned. History does not ask us to relive these moments, only to remember them, to learn from them, and to carry their lessons forward. Thank you for spending this time with history. May memory endure where destruction once ruled, and may the silence of Stalingrad remind us why peace must never be taken for granted. Good night.